Cowpoke, a classic Western action thriller, a Rip Campbell adventure. Written by Curtis Long. Narrated by David Kresser. Chapter 1. The third guard had gone out to the herd, and the men that had been relieved, having taken coffee from the pot on the fire, were now stretched out beneath tarp-covered blankets. One of the off-duty guards was snoring, and the other was lying, face pillowed on his arm, dead to the world. Combe Andrews, wagon boss for Old Man Meadows of the Circle P, sat on the edge of his tarp and pulled on his boots. This was his third trip up the trail, his first as wagon boss. So far he had got by, but he'd been lucky. Yeah, lucky and unlucky. The 1,500 head of steers he convoyed were as jumpy as a bunch he'd ever seen. They spooked at anything and at everything. Twice they had run in the daytime, once when a small dog came charging and yapping down on the flank of the herd, and once when a bronc had come undone and pitched off his rider. 3 times they had run at night. What had caused those night runs, Combs couldn't say. However, he had his suspicions. One night run had occurred when Bert Guthrie, the straw boss, was on guard, and the other 2 when Bill Walters had been on watch. Now, Guthrie was jealous of him, Andrews knew that, and Bill Walters was mighty thick with Guthrie. Stamping on his boots, Combe Andrews walked over to the bed wagon where his horse stood tied to a wheel. He would just take a little passer out to the herd and see how they were doing out there. The bunch of steers would run off if a rider lit a cigarette within sight, or if a careless man popped a quirt against his chaps, or undid a slicker to put it on during a sudden gust of rain. Real spooky they were. As he walked to his horse, Andrew passed a long, tarp-wrapped bundle on the ground. He grinned down at the sleeper. That was Rip Campbell, and he was part of Combe Andrews' good luck. True, the herd had run, but so far they had generally run in the right direction, and Combe hadn't lost a steer. He had started with 1,500 big steers and 11 men, and he still had them all. Rip Campbell had been largely responsible for that. Combe liked the rusty-haired boy who lay so quietly in his suggins. Rip Campbell liked Combe, too. The foreman could tell. He still had a mental picture of Rip Campbell back in the little trail town of Cantu. Rip Campbell standing, a derisive grin on his square, homely face, and the little gold flecks dancing in his hazel eyes, well, he took it out of Guthrie. Guthrie had been shooting off his mouth in the barroom, talking about his wagon boss, and Rip had called his hand. Rip didn't even know that Combe had heard that byplay. There was another memory in Comb's mind, too. Another picture of Rip sitting his horse on a sandbar while the herd crossed the Canadian. Tough crossing that would have been. Combe breathed easier now that it was over. Combe Andrews tightened the cinch of his saddle, untied his night horse, and, sticking a toe in the stirrup, mounted and rode softly away from the sleeping camp. From under the chuck wagon, the snores of old Doughboy Toms, the cook, followed him. Riding away, Combe awakened no one. Men trailing cattle will wake when their relief comes to camp at night. Sometimes other things will wake them, but generally they're too worn out with a day's work to bother about anything but sleep. The herd was a mile from the camp, bedded against a mesa. A little creek ran down from the mesa, and a canyon followed up to the rim. Pretty country, but tough, Combe Andrews thought as he rode. A bad place for a run. He hoped that the steers were tired enough to stay on the bed ground tonight. As he approached the black loom of the sleeping cattle, he began to sing, his voice unmelodious and rough. Over across the herd, the voice of Chuck Blossom, smooth and tenor, was softly lilting the Red River Valley. Where was Bill Walters? Combe strained his eyes to catch sight of the other guard. The cattle were close now. Comb was as near as a man riding guard would get. He looked to the right and left. His song had almost died on his lips. Beside him loomed a man on horseback. Comb could see him. The rider had something lifted in his hand. "Bill?" asked Comb Andrews softly. The lifted hand come down. A quirt popped against a chap's leg, and with that noise the cattle were on their feet. The quirt popped again. Bill Walter said, "Curse you, Andrews! Snaking!" His horse was beside Combs's horse. Something hard was thrust into Comb's side. The cattle were running full out, and Chuck Blossom's yell was lost in the popping of their hooves. Fire from that hard object burned Comb Andrews' side. He slumped forward. He didn't hear Bill Walters say, "Blast it, I've got to take 'em with me." He didn't hear anything anymore. Chapter 2. 2 weeks later, High Meadows sat in a lobby of the Alps Hotel in Denver and scrutinized Rip Campbell with hard, unwinking blue eyes. "You said you wanted to see me?" questioned Rip, sinking down in a big leather-covered chair beside Meadows. Meadows stroked his little beard. That beard and the weathered oak face of the man that wore it were known from San Angelo north all along the trail. "Yeah, you're Rip Campbell, ain't you?" said High Meadows. Rip nodded. "Then I sent you word I wanted to see you," said Meadows. "I've been hearing about you. Likely if I'd heard about you before we started north, I wouldn't have hired you." Rip lolled lazily in his chair. He was used to talking to these big men, Rip was. He had worked for a lot of them, and while they had power, money, and men to back them, Rip Campbell was never nervous in their presence, for Rip Campbell had power too. Not the power of men and money, but the power to look a man in the eyes, to face a man through powder smoke if necessary, and see a thing through. All his life, Rip Campbell had worked for wages. He was a top hand, none better, but it went beyond that, for Rip Campbell had been born in the Tonto Basin, had lost his father and his mother in one of the Tonto's little wars, and from the time he was 10, Rip had either been hunted or a hunter. Something of his success, something of his reputation was felt in Meadows' next speech. "So, you're Rip Campbell," drawled Meadows. "You worked for the Stock Association in Arizona, didn't you?" Rip nodded. "And you're the fellow that cleaned up Prescott when it needed it," pursued Meadows. "Well, I was in Prescott." Meadows leaned forward. "What happened to my cattle?" he demanded. Rip felt for paper and tobacco. "They run," he said, drawing out his makings. "They'd been running and they ran again, just after we'd crossed the Canadian. We gathered them, and when we tallied them, there was 400 head missing, and your wagon boss was gone." "I know that," snapped Meadows. "How'd it happen?" "Well," Rip lit his smoke. "We bedded them against a mesa that had 2 canyons splitting it. That was after we had crossed the river. That night, come 3rd guard, the herd ran. We got up, and one of the guards came in and said that they'd gone east. We rode that way. In the morning, we hunched cattle and combed the country. We got most of them, but Comb Andrews was missing. We went back and combed out the country above the other canyon. There was Malpias there, and couldn't have tracked an elephant over. It run in a horseshoe and bent down to where the Canadian took a bend. We didn't find the steers that we'd missed, and we worked 2 days trying. Andrews didn't show up, and Guthrie said that Andrews had gone with the steers and that we had a delivery date, so he brought us along. When we got here, Guthrie paid me off. We'd had words before that." Rip puffed his smoke. Meadows' eyes were keen. "You think Andrews got away with the steers?" he asked. Rip looked at the end of his cigarette. He was a right good cowman, but not that good," he drawled. If those steers were run over Malapias, it would have taken plenty riders to hold them on the rocks. Then where'd they go when they came off the Malapias? No, I think Andrew was with the cattle when they ran, or right afterward, but I don't think he's with them now. What would you do if you was me? Meadows drawled the words, his blue eyes half hidden by droopy lids. Rip shrugged. I don't know, he answered. What were you figuring to do? Meadow pushed his questioning. Again Rip shrugged. Why, he said, carefully choosing his words, I like Andrews pretty good. I thought maybe I'd drop back into that country and sort of look him up. Blue eyes met hazel. Gold flecks were dancing in the hazel eyes, but Rip's face was impassive. $100 a month in your outfit, grunted High Meadows. Give you $2 a head for every steer you get back. Suit you? What about Andrews? The hazel eyes were keen. Why, High Meadows looked at the ceiling. I've sort of raised Combe Andrews. Man and boy, I've known him for 20 years. I like him. I'd take it kindly if you'd looked him up. Suppose I find him with the steers? Meadows considered that. If he wanted them steers worse than he wanted my friendship, he's welcome to them, he said. And suppose I find him dead? Rip spoke the words flatly. Then, drawled Meadows, I suppose you'd act according. You liked him, you say. You can consider yourself the Circle P troubleshooter, and I'll back you up. Rip got up from his chair. I'm on my way, he said briefly. I'd like some expense money. I'll leave you a letter and some money at the desk, said Meadows. 2 months' salary. If you can't do it in 2 months, you ain't gonna do it, and you needn't report back. Suit you? Suits me, agreed Rip softly. Meadows' old, blue-veined, brown-spotted hand met Rip's young, firm, tanned one and gripped. Good luck, said High Meadows. I'll need it, answered Rip Campbell. When he left Meadows, Rip Campbell had a definite plan in mind. There was a big general store a short distance down the street from the Alps Hotel, and Rip went there to make several purchases. He had ridden a portion of the country in which the Circle P steers and wagon boss had disappeared, and had stopped at one ranch back of the Malapias horseshoe. Now, in the big store, he bought bib overalls, brogans, a straw hat, and a red bandana neckerchief. He bought some other things and came out of the store carrying an armload. He had hardly been gone 10 minutes before another man entered, caught the same clerk that had waited on Rip, and practically duplicated the purchases. You're the second man that has been buying this stuff today, said the clerk to his customer. I can't figure out why you cowmen are going in for Granger rigging. You wrap that stuff up and tell me what the bill is, said the customer. Maybe the cowpunchers have got some sense and decided to farm. The clerk wrapped up the parcel and tendered the bill, feeling thoroughly squelched. Back in the Alps Hotel, Rip Campbell put his new wardrobe into a canvas sack. Leaving his room, he went to the desk where he received an envelope and paid his bill. Then he departed. At the livery stable where he had left his saddle, Rip made inquiries. He didn't need to worry about horses. He'd been riding Meadows' horses on the trail north, and old High Meadows had disposed of a whole mount. The livery stableman said that there were freight outfits pulling out almost daily for the south, and told Rip where he might find a reliable freighter. Leaving the livery, Rip encountered Chuck Blossom. Chuck had been celebrating his arrival in Denver and his payday, and he wanted company. Hey, Rip, he called. Come on and have a drink. Rip didn't have time for a drink, but he liked Chuck. Sure, he answered. The two crossed the street, entered a saloon, and going up to the bar, ordered beer. While they were waiting for the bartender to draw their beer, Rip heard voices in a booth behind him. Turning, he saw Bill Walters and Arch Guthrie drinking together. Guthrie looked up and, catching Rip's eye, said something to Walters. Walters turned to look, and then, getting up from his seat, came out of the booth. "Hello, Campbell," he said. "Celebrating?" "Some," Rip said briefly. "Say," Walters was loud-mouthed with the liquor he had drunk. "You shut off your mouth down in Cantu about what a fellow Combs Andrews was. What do you think of him now, son? Running off his boss's cattle." "I think just the same of him now than I did then," answered Rip, turning to take his glass of beer. "He was a good man with a rotten crew." "The hell you say," Walter blustered. "I was on that crew, you know." Rip's hazel eyes surveyed Walters bleakly. "And I still say that it was rotten," he observed, and took a gulp of his beer. Walter's face flushed, and Chuck Blossom laughed tauntingly. "Come on back and sit down, Bill," called Guthrie nervously. "This feller talking awful loud," blustered Walters, ignoring Guthrie's demand. "I'm going to take some of the rough off of him. So you think the crew was rotten just because I was on it, do you?" "You and some others." Rip set his glass back on the bar. He watched Walters narrowly. It was against the law to go armed in Denver, but the law was not always rigidly enforced. There was a telltale bulge in the waistband of Walters' Levi's. Walters drew back slightly. Some of his intoxication must have been assumed because his voice was now sober, coldly insulting. "Cow thief's always cotton to cow thief," he said deliberately. "That must be why you stick up for Andrews. You—" The bartender had gone down behind the bar. Blossom was moving in swiftly, and the barman was coming up again, bringing with him his pacifier, a 10-gauge double-barrel gun. But both moved too slowly. Walters had reached for the gun in his waistband as he spoke, but Rip Campbell, perfectly balanced and with the experience of 100 such encounters, leaned in and whipped a left, short-handed blow to the third button on Walter's shirt. That third button was just over the solar plexus, and Walters, his breath completely gone, lost all control of his arms. When the bartender swiveled the shotgun, Rip Campbell was standing with Walter's gun in his hand. Walters was on the floor, and Guthrie was settling back in his seat, his hands falling away from his armpit. "Pay for the drink, Chuck," commanded Rip, his voice hard. "Then we'll get out of here. Guthrie, you make another move like that, and I'll take the gun you tote for my collection. Get going, Chuck." "You want them arrested?" demanded the bartender. "They framed the play. If you want them taken in, say the word and I'll get a deputy." Rip shook his head. They're just playful," he answered. "Keep them here until I leave so somebody won't get killed. Walters, I'm going to keep your gun. It ain't safe for you to have one. Maybe I'll ship it to you, maybe I won't. Let's go, Chuck." Chuck was ready. Sober by the sudden action, he had put his money on the bar and stood watching Rip. The bartender, a man of parts, was staring balefully at Walters and Guthrie, shotgun very much in evidence. "Set still," warned the barman. "You tin horns can't get away with nothing like that in here. When these gents have left, I'm going to count to 10 and then pull both triggers. Hear me?" Rip and Chuck Blossom backed out of the door, Rip tucking Walter's gun into his trousers. As the swing doors closed behind the two, they heard the bartender say harshly, "1, 2. Chuck and Rip parted outside the door. Blossom went on toward the railroad station. Rip headed for the warehouse of a freight outfit. He had already made his plan, and now he was ready to carry it out. At the warehouse of Abercrombie & Jones, there was much confusion. A string of wagons was pulled up alongside the loading platform, and sweating men were loading them. Rip accosted a loafer. The wagons, he was told, were leaving for the south, going down into New Mexico. Here was an opportunity. Still carrying his canvas bag, he hurried to the livery stable where his saddle was stored. There, despite the curiosity of the holster, Rip stripped in an empty stall and put on the new clothes. What he had taken off went into the sack, and the sack was tied. Rip got a grain sack from the holster, put his saddle and riding gear into it, and then went back to the warehouse. Dumping his two burdens on the platform, Rip found a clerk. "I want to ship these bundles to Trinchera," he told the clerk. "There's a cowboy paid me to get 'em shipped. Can you take 'em?" The clerk surveyed Rip. "Got an outfit leaving today. They'll go through Trinchera," said the clerk. "Well, come on and we'll weigh them up." Rip, lugging saddle and war sack, followed the clerk. "Who's the boss of the wagons?" he asked as he dumped the saddle on the scales. "I'd like to hire on with them for a roustabout. I got a bedroll I can work." The clerk looked up from juggling weights. That's him over there," he said, pointing. "Maybe he can use you." Rip waited until the saddle and the other bundles were weighed. Then, paying the charges, he walked over to the heavy-set, black-bearded man who was watching the loading of the wagons. Blackbeard was short and to the point. He asked questions that Rip answered vaguely. Blackbeard was a judge of men. He noted Rip's smooth, tan cheeks and his heavy shoulders and the supple movement. "Well," snapped Blackbeard finally, "I don't know what you've done or why you want to leave Denver. That ain't my business. I'll hire you. Give you $1 a day and your chuck." "Suits me," said Rip Campbell. So when Abercrombie and Jones' wagons pulled out of Denver late that afternoon, Rip Campbell sat atop a tarp-covered wagon and stared at the broad back of the driver handling the team. He was on his way. Chapter 3. It took the wagon train over a week to reach Trinchera. The little cow town perched among the mountains north of the Canadian was Rip's destination. There Rip proceeded to take several drinks, act as if he had taken many more, and thoroughly cursing the wagon master, get himself fired. When the wagon pulled out of Trinchera, Rip stood in the street and tried to look woebegone. It was a far different Rip Campbell that stood in Trinchera Street from the Rip Campbell who had left Denver. The brogans were battered now, and the bib overalls were caked with dirt. The straw hat he wore denied any acquaintance with the aristocracy of a Stetson, and the blue shirt was dirty and missing buttons. But the greatest change was in Rip's cheeks. A 10-day stubble of rusty beard covered his cheeks. He was dirty. Indeed, Rip was dirty from the skin out. He was playing a role and playing it for all it was worth. For 2 days after the wagons left, Rip lazied about the little cow town. He drank a little, listened a lot, and at the end of 2 days knew a few things that he needed badly to know. The next morning, rising early, he washed his face and went down to Trinchera's one general store. In its warehouse were a saddle and war sack waiting for the owner to claim them. Rip wondered if, at the end of his 2 months, he would walk into the store and get them. From 7 o'clock on, he hung around the store. People went in and out in greater numbers than usual, for it was Saturday. About noon, a light rig whirled up to the store, and a portly, bearded man got out and reached up to help a girl dismount. Rip waited until the team was tied to the hitch rack before he moved forward. While he waited, he looked at the girl. Black-haired, olive-cheeked, with flashing black eyes and a warm, generous mouth. She stood waiting for the man to finish tying the team. When the man had secured the horses and started toward the waiting girl, Rip stepped forward. "Mr. McGregor," he asked, making his voice whine. McGregor stopped short. "What do you want?" "I heard you wanted hay hands," mumbled Rip, keeping his eyes down. "I like to get a job." "Ever cut any hay?" asked McGregor. "I cut hay and stacked," answered Rip. "I'm a good hand at a stack." McGregor grunted. "Got a bed?" "Yes, sir." "I pay $1.50 a day." McGregor's tone was curt. "And you gotta get along with Granny Black. It's a wagon outfit, you know. We move around and cut hay on the Vegas. If you can stack hay, I'll hire you." "I can stack hay." "What do they call you?" demanded McGregor. "Rip," answered Rip Campbell promptly. "Have your bed here at 4 o'clock," ordered McGregor. "I'll take you to the ranch." "Yes, sir." Rip ducked his head. "I'll be there." "If you aren't, there won't be any job," McGregor told him and crossed the walk to the waiting girl. At 4 o'clock, Rip was at Bly's store waiting. He was still waiting at 5 o'clock, and it was not until 5:30 that McGregor and the buckboard arrived. McGregor told Rip to put his bedroll in the back of the buckboard and jump on, and Rip obeyed the order. A box of supplies was carried out from Bly's and loaded in, and McGregor took the lines and drove the team on down the street. At a dwelling set well back from the road, McGregor stopped. "Go get Charlotte," he said, looking back over his shoulder at Rip. Rip climbed out of the buckboard and, going up to the walk to the house, knocked on the door. "Is Miss McGregor here?" he asked the white-haired woman who answered the knock. "I'll get her," was the reply, and Rip waited. Presently, dark-haired Charlotte McGregor came out to the door, her arm around a blonde girl who, shorter than Charlotte, was laughing at her. "I'll be expecting you this week, then, Burl," said Charlotte McGregor. "You'll let her come, won't you, Mrs. White?" The white-haired motherly woman smiled and nodded, and Charlotte, after kissing both of them, bade them goodbye and walked past Rip. Apparently, she didn't even see him at all. In the buckboard, leaving Trinchera, Rip sat on his bedroll and listened, unabashed, to the conversation in the front seat. It was part of his business to listen to conversations, and he had no qualms or scruples. But he heard nothing. The conversation between Ian McGregor and his daughter had to do with plans for the visit of Burl White to the McGregor ranch, and that was all. The buckboard rolled along at a steady gait. McGregor had 2 good horses, broncs such as a ranchman might be expected to drive, but trotters, evidently with some standard-bred blood in them. They cut off the miles, but the sun was racing them and winning. It was dusk before the road swung south, and a full 3 hours had elapsed before McGregor stopped for Rip to open a gate. When the gate was replaced and Rip was back on the bedroll again, the tired horses walked down a lane. Rip could see the fence post on either side, went through another gate already down, and stopped. A man came running from a lighted building and took the team bits. McGregor spoke to Rip. "You go down to the old bunkhouse," he directed. "You'll find a lamp down there. Take any of the bunks, and then see if the cook will feed you. I haven't got any hay crew in yet, just 1 man, so you won't be crowded." With that, he lifted the box of groceries from the buckboard and walked over to Charlotte, who had already gone to the big house that bulked black some distance from the vehicle. "Where's the old bunkhouse?" asked Rip of the man who held the team. "Oh, down back of the house where you see the light, Granger," answered the cowboy. Rip shouldered his bedding and walked toward the light, and the puncher led the team away. Arriving at the bunkhouse, an old rock structure built behind the newer cabin that served the riders, Rip struck matches, located the lamp, lit it, and threw his bed on a bunk. A tousle-headed kid in another bunk rolled over and then sat up when the light struck his eyes. Rip, opening his bed, nodded to the boy. "Just got in," he said. The boy lay back in his blankets. "You'll be out at 3, he said sleepily. "Better turn in." Rick grinned and began to undress. No use bothering the cook at this time of night, and if the tassel-haired kid was right, morning was going to be coming mighty early on Ian McGregor's triangle dot spread. Cupping a hand over the lamp chimney, Rip blew out the light and slid into his blankets. The tassel-head kid was right. Before dawn, there was a yell in the bunkhouse, and a raucous voice demanded attention. "Get up, you Grangers! Want to sleep all day? Get up!" Rip rolled over in his bed and looked at the door, saw in the dim light a short, squat, broad-shouldered man. Rip sat up in his bed, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and looked again. The man who had called was gone, and fresh morning air was streaming through the open door. Rip grinned at the kid on the other bunk, threw back the covers, and put his feet on the cold floor. As they dressed, the two occupants of the bunkhouse introduced themselves. The kid gave his name as Spanky Cosgrove. The man who had called them, Spanky said, was Granny Black, McGregor's foreman for the Granger outfit. Granny had several other things, none of them very pleasant, according to Spanky. With their clothing on, the two washed, Rip rather thoroughly, Spanky with a lick and a promise. Then they went to the cook shack. There were 2 tables set. One had 2 places, the other 10. Spanky led the way to the table with 2 places, and presently the triangle dot punchers came in and sat down on the big table. There's an aristocracy of cowboys. The true cowman, the puncher, cowboy, call him what you will, does only the work that can be done on horseback or that a horse will carry him to do. Haying, making fences, building tanks, erecting windmills, these things were done by a Granger crew. The 10 men who sat on the big table were cowpunchers. That made all the difference. When the punchers had been served, the cook, a man with one leg shorter than the other, brought food to Spanky and Rip. At the big table, the cowboy talked among themselves. At the other table, the two ate in dead silence, broken only by the sound of Spanky sucking up his coffee from a saucer. Rip listened to the talk on the other table. As usual, it concerned horses, the previous day's work, conditions of range and cattle, the usual ranch conversation. Nothing interesting, nothing out of the way. Still, Rip singled out a man or two. There were a big, bearded one the others called Gray, and a smaller, wrinkled man called Till, who drew his attention. The two sat together at the end of the table and didn't say much. Apparently, they were partners, and apparently, too, they hadn't been with the triangle dot very long. The fact came out in the course of the conversation when Till asked for information concerning a certain portion of the country. 2 others also drew Rip's attention. Margrove, the foreman, a gray-haired, barrel-chested, runty granny. Rip knew that he would have plenty to do with Granny. Watching the little man, Rip could not help but like him. Granny Black's face was rode hard, but there was a twinkle in his eye that promised a good many things. When the meal was done, the cowboys went out, following Margrove toward the corrals and saddle sheds, and Black came over to Rip and Spanky's table. "Heyin'," said Granny Black. "Won't start till we get a crew. Today, you'll clean a tank here by the house. Come on." Spanky and Rip rose and followed him. At the corrals, the riders were saddling. Margrove was laying out the work to several who already had their saddles on mounts. And as the men came out with their horses, he gave further directions. Singly or in pairs, the riders left, and finally, Margrove was alone. He nodded to Black and said, "It's all yours, Granny," and started toward the big house where the smoke was just beginning to come from the chimney. Granny Black took hold of Rip's arm. "You see them mules?" Rip saw them all right. There were 4 of them, big bay animals with long ears and collar galls on their necks. "You'll find some chain harnesses in the barn," Granny Black went on. "Hitch them mules to the Fresno in the yard, and then go to the tank over there and scrape out the sand. It's full." Black turned away, then stopped. "And don't swear," he admonished. "The tank's right behind the house, and I don't want you shocking the ladies." With that, he was gone. Tramping off around the corral, Spanky looked at Rip. "Them mules are devils," said Spanky. Rip shrugged. "Yeah, let's get the harnesses," he proposed. Spanky Cosgrove knew where the harnesses was kept, and he and Rip brought it to the corral. While they were carrying it out, Black, his blue eyes twinkling, passed them again without a word and went on into the barn. "Now," grunted Spanky, dumping harness on the fence, "he'll stay in there and watch us and laugh, and when we don't get the job done, he'll come out and raise hob with us. You wait and see." Rip's eyes narrowed. "Didn't I see a rope in the saddle room?" he asked. "Sure, there's one there," answered Spanky. "But what good will that do us? I can't rope much, and—" "You go get it," drawled Rip. "I never caught a mule yet by putting salt on his tail." Puzzled, Spanky went toward the saddle shed, and Rip, climbing the bars of the corral, stood in the dust inside and eyed the mules and horses that had been left. He liked the looks of the triangle dot mounts, and he liked the looks of those mules. Well, Spanky came back carrying the rope and handed it over the fence. "I still don't see—" he began. "Come in here and bring them around for me," Rip commanded, laying out the rope. "I figured to harness them mules." Spanky climbed the fence, and Rip coiled the rope and shook out a loop. "Now bring them around," he ordered. There was a snubbing post in the center of the round corral. Rip, rope in hand, walked toward it. Spanky started the mules and the few horses around the corral. As the first mule, a big bay, passed Rip, the roper turned his back, his hand flipped out, and an open loop stood on his edge like a barrel hoop. The running mule put both front feet through the loop, and Rip, snapping his rope up, snubbed short on the post. The mule hit the end of that rope, went over, and thumped on the ground. Spanky knew enough to run and sit on the struggling animal's head, and Rip, coming up the rope, caught a hind foot in a half hitch, caught the other hind foot, and pulled it tight. 2 more wraps of the rope, and he straightened. "Just sit there," directed Rip Campbell. "It ain't hard to harness a mule on the ground." In the barn, Granny Black rubbed his eyes and then peered again through the crack he was using. Rip was dumping chain harness down upon a supine mule. 3 times the procedure was repeated, and each time a harness mule was added to those tied to the fence outside the corral. Then, with Rip handling the lines, the mules moved docilely off towards the Fresno. Granny Black, carefully slipping out the rear door of the barn, watched the 4 mules pull the Fresno toward the dry tank he had indicated. Then, disbelief still in his eyes, the little boss of the Granger wagon went hurriedly towards the house. "Farmer," he said as he walked. "Farmer he is like hell." Chapter 4. Ian McGregor was just about to get up from the table when Black came in. He walked over to the door, nodded to the old man, and preceded him to the little room that he used for an office. Inside the office, seating himself, he looked up and spoke. "What's on your mind, Granny?" Granny Black sat on the edge of the table that McGregor used for a desk and swung a short, booted leg. "Yeah, that fellow you hired to hay," he said. "The one you call Rip? He ain't no more a Granger than I am." "No?" drawled McGregor. "No. You ought to see him harness them mules. 4-footed them as neat as you please and laid them on the ground." Granger? Shucks, he'd make a top hand in any man's outfit. So? Well, so I'm wondering, said Granny Black, if he's another one of those ranger detectives you've been hiring. McGregor sat erect in his chair. Who said that I've been hiring range detectives? He demanded. Black shrugged. It's plain as the nose on your face, he answered familiarly. That fellow Gray and that runt Till couldn't be nothing else. You've been losing cattle, but I'm darned if I thought you'd lost so many that you'd throw men in here like them. Who else thinks they're detectives? Demanded McGregor harshly. Black shrugged. How do I know what the men think? He countered. When you going to get the rest of the hay crew? They'll be coming along as Bly hires them, answered McGregor. I told him to send out some men, and he said he'd get them. We got to be cutting pretty soon, said Black. I hope Bly does send them. Say, if you want to see something nice, you go out and watch that Rip handle them 4 mules. He's getting along right well, and if he handles them many mornings like he did this son, all you'll have to do is to show them a rope and they'll lie down to be harnessed. Black slipped down from the table and McGregor stood up. You keep your mouth shut, Granny, he warned. About me hiring men, I mean. That fellow Till is from the Stock Association. I don't know where Gray came from. I took him on when I put Till to work. I thought that if I hired 2 of them at a time, I'd kind of mix things up if somebody was watching. Get it? Granny Black grinned. I get it, he said. And Rip ain't no detective? Not that I know, answered McGregor. Black's grin widened. Then he's on the dodge, he said. A heck of an outfit this is getting to be. Well, I don't care. I don't want to know what he done. He'll make a hand anyhow. With that, Granny Black pulled down his hat and left. When he was gone, Ian McGregor sat back down in his chair and put his feet up on the table. A heck of an outfit, Granny had said. Maybe Granny Black didn't know just how much of a heck of an outfit the Triangle Dot was getting to be. It took 2 days for Rip and Spanky to clean the tank and fix up the walls. They did a nice job. Granny Black came around and looked at the work and grunted, but he didn't have any fault to find. That was something. The mules behaved. A repetition of the roping of the first morning made pretty good mules out of them. Rip felt that he was earning his $150 a day. He learned a lot from Spanky. Spanky was a local boy, the son of a nester who was having heavy sledding of it up on the mesa west of the Triangle Dot headquarters, and he knew a lot about the outfit. This was his second summer working for McGregor, and he talked freely. From Spanky, Rip learned something of the country, something of the Triangle Dot. Granny Black had been with McGregor since the time the chunk was laid. He was old now and didn't do any active riding, and his place as foreman had gradually been taken by Herb Margrove. Granny resented that change, and so Spanky said was jealous of Margrove. Whitby aspired to be one of Margrove's riders, and indeed the tall, taciturn foreman showed Spanky some consideration. Of the others, Spanky hadn't much to say. Most of the men had been at the Triangle Dot for a year or more. Only Gray Cook and Till Summers were new hands. Harvey Little rode the rough string and was Spanky's hero. The rest he just spoke of and passed over. However, there was one person on the Triangle Dot about whom Spanky spoke at length. That was Charlotte McGregor. Charlotte had been east to school, and she was stuck up, big-headed, and conceited, according to Spanky. Rip reserved judgment. He liked the girl's looks. Moreover, he noticed that she spent as much time as she could with Harvey Little, who was a square-faced, grinning kid, and it seemed to Rip that a stuck-up girl would have dodged the company of an ordinary cow-puncher. Rip had already learned that Sunday was just another day on the Triangle Dot. The work went right on, rain or shine, Sunday or Monday. McGregor worked as hard as his men, and Rip, listening and watching, was not so sure as he had been that his suspicions were correct. Rip had chosen work with the Granger outfit because he knew that he must have some excuse for being in the country, and that he must not attract attention. The role of Granger hand-fitted those requirements perfectly. The riders would pay no attention to him as a hay hand, and as the Granger wagon moved around, Rip could look over the country. Most important, Granger hands are usually drifters and talk a lot. With someone like Spanky, who knew the country, to help in the talking, Rip felt certain that he could hear something that would give him a lead. 3 days after he had arrived at the Triangle Dot, Bly, the merchant of Trinchera, sent 10 more men out to the ranch. The day after that, Bly himself arrived with 2 others, one of whom was a cook. This completed the hay crew, and Granny Black had men to boss. He had already put Rip and Spanky at work getting mowers and other equipment ready, and now the work stock was brought in and the business picked up. Rip, sizing up Bly and the newcomers, thought that he had never seen a harder-looking crew. There was not a man that Bly had brought out that didn't look as though he could cut a throat for 2 bits. Bly himself was a long, slender hombre with black eyes set close together and a long, thin nose above a little, tight mouth. Spanky had already told Rip that Bly was the big man of Trinchera, that he had a ranch as well as a stair, and that he did what banking business was done in the little town. Rip's opinion of the inhabitants of the Mesa country was lowered considerably when he heard that. Personally, he would not have trusted Bly with a plugged nickel. With the hay crew complete, the mowers and rakes were loaded on wagons. Bedrolls were tossed up, the remuda was turned over to Spanky to wrangle, and Granny Black appeared with a gun strapped to his fat old middle. The drivers took the lines, and with Granny riding the horse as fat as himself, the outfit pulled out for the first meadow. The first jump was 8 miles. At the end of the drive, camp was set up alongside a hay meadow. That afternoon, the crew began to cut hay. Rip had thought he was to work on the stacks, but Granny changed the idea for him. Rip got a mower with a team of fractious broncs. More than that, when the remuda had been brought into the rope corral, Granny had called Rip over, handed him a saddle rope, and ordered him to rope out the horses for the other drivers. Hiding his surprise behind his now considerable beard, Rip had obeyed the order. Bumping along on the seat of the mower, Rip cut hay and considered his position. Here he was, right where he wanted to be. The Canadian was not 12 miles away, and the Horseshoe Mesa, with its hard Malapayas rim, was not over 10 miles distant. Still, he hadn't made any progress in his quest. Rip thought it over. Then he stopped his mower and, oil can in hand, oiled around. If he didn't run into something pretty soon, he decided, he would quit this job, go get his saddle and gear, hire a couple of horses, and ride the country. But that was the last resort. Better stay with this job a while, for it had McGregor's Triangle Dot that Rip had visited when looking for the missing Circle P steers, and the Horseshoe Mesa was on Triangle Dot Range. That night at supper, Rip had cause to be pleased with his decision. When dusk was settling and the men were squatted about the fire eating, Big Grey Cook came riding in to tell Granny that he was to stay the night. After supper, Gray drew aside a squint-eyed, pock-marked man called Ted Daly, and the two talked until long after the others had gone to bed. Rip caught none of the conversation, but he did watch the two, and when they parted, Rip would have bet that he was on a trail, some kind of trail at least. Morning came, and fortune threw favors in Rip's lap. When the Nighthawk brought in the remuda, there was horses missing. Granny Black swore and raved and ended by calling for Rip. When Rip arrived, Black gave orders. "Listen," said Granny. "You're no farmer. I've seen your rope. Now you take a horse and saddle and you go find them runaways, and don't you come back till you do. You hear me?" One or two old saddles had been brought out from the ranch for just such contingencies. Rip secured one of these, took the most likely-looking horse that he could find, and set out, first securing information from the Nighthawk as to where the horses had been held during the night. It was no particular task to find the horses. They had headed back toward the ranch pasture, and Rip found them against the fence. He drove them back with him, back toward camp, and then an idea struck him. Here he was, loose and with time on his hands. He might as well spend the day out here. Rip turned the horses he was driving and headed for the Horseshoe Mesa. He had never been thoroughly satisfied with his investigation of the mesa. Leaving the horses atop the mesa, he rode to the rim and scouted along the Malapias. He didn't expect to find tracks, didn't expect to find much of anything, but he was reconstructing a happening. 400 head of big 4-year-old Circle P steers had disappeared in this Malapias, and Rip wanted to know how they had done it. He rode along the edge of the Malapias until the rim broke off and stretched down to the hard pan of the river bottom. There he stopped his horse and sat looking over the country. Down there was the Canadian River, just as he had seen it on that other occasion, and down there, Rip leaned forward in his saddle. Down there at the bank of the river was a man. Rip watched him. He saw him skirt along the river, riding aimlessly. He saw him stop and dismount, and then he saw the rider, climbing back on his horse, falter as his leg crossed the cantle of the saddle. The horse whirled, and the rider fell flat. And faint through the distance, the echo of a shot drifted up to Rip Campbell. The rider's horse trotted a few steps, stopped, looking back, and the man lay flat on the ground by the river. Rip waited. He had not recognized that rider, nor had he seen smoke from the shot. The man lay there, a black Mary on the ground. The horse stood a moment with a raised head, then lowered it and moved slowly across the hard pan towards grass and fell to grazing. High in the sky was a black speck, a buzzard. Rip moved his horse towards the slope, and then down the river came another rider, his horse moving as though on business. Rip watched this new arrival, saw him suddenly straighten in his saddle, and the horse broke into a lope. Rip saw him slide the horse to a stop, throw himself out of his saddle, and then saw him bend down over the man on the ground. Then Rip wheeled his mount and rode back. Rip picked up his strays about where he had left them and started along toward camp. The things that he had seen filled his mind with questions. As he sent the horses down over the slope of the mesa, he wondered who that rider had been, who the second man was. Had the second man shot the first? Rip thought not. He had acted surprised, and he had surely shaken out his horse to get to the prone body. Still, one couldn't be sure. Maybe that was an act. Rip was putting on an act, so why not somebody else? McGregor was coming up the river. There was a carbine in the saddle scabbard under the fender of McGregor's saddle. Rip waited. "Strays?" demanded McGregor, coming up and halting his horse. "Yes, sir," said Rip, and did not take his hand from the bib of his overalls. "Mr. Black sent me to gather them." "Where'd you find them?" McGregor was short. "Over against the mesa," answered Rip. McGregor considered the man. "Black says that you're a cowpuncher," he said. Rip cursed the mules and his roping under his breath. "I ain't a puncher," he whined. "I've been around ranches some, but I ain't a puncher." McGregor seemed about to say something and then thought better of it. "I'll help you take 'em in," he offered. "Thanks," said Rip. The two moved on after the strays. Rip was careful to let himself slump in the saddle, to let his arms move with the trot of his horse. Just a full Granger and bib overalls, Rip Campbell was. Sure, that was all. From the corner of his eyes, McGregor watched his companion, and Rip did not miss that scrutiny. The crew was cutting hay when Rip and McGregor got in with the strays. Granny told Rip where the remuda was, and Rip took the horses on out and turned them over to Spanky, who was day wrangling. When he came back, Granny put him on the stack. The hay was coming in pretty fast, and Rip was kept busy. Ted Daly, also stacking, worked just across from Rip. McGregor and Granny stood talking together. Rip, building stack carefully, waited for developments. They were not long in coming. A man on a big black horse pulled into the meadow, and behind him, lying across the saddle, was another man. The rider was Herb Margrove, Triangle Dot foreman, and Rip could see from the top of his stack that the prone bundle lying across the saddle of the second horse was Till Summers. Margrove's arrival caused a furor. Men quit work and flocked around. Margrove unroped Summers and laid him on the ground. The man was dead. There was no disputing that. Margrove stood over Summers and answered McGregor's questions. McGregor kept his head. He didn't go off half-cocked. He asked Margrove what had happened, and Rip, who had come down from his stack, listened to the answers. Margrove, so he said, had been riding down the river and had seen a man on the ground and a grazing horse nearby. Riding up and dismounting, he'd found Summers, who, shot through the chest, was dying even as Margrove bent over him. The foreman's face was hard as he talked, but not harder than McGregor's rock-like countenance, and Rip noticed something as he listened to the talk that checked so exactly with what he had seen. There was a rifle lashed on Margrove's saddle. Chapter 5. McGregor issued orders. The hay wagon was unloaded. Till Summers' body was loaded on it and taken to the ranch, and from the ranch a message was to go to Trinchera to Jack Davis, the deputy sheriff there. With that attended to, McGregor singled out Rip. "Get yourself a horse, Rip," he commanded. "You and Margrove and me will go back down the river and look around." Rip still had his horse in camp. He got the animal, and when he rejoined Margrove and McGregor, found them ready to ride. Granny Black was with them, expostulating and trying to go along, but McGregor was obdurate. "Somebody's got to stay here and run the outfit," he said. "That's your job, Granny." Perforce, Granny stayed. But before the three left, the old foreman came over to Rip. Unbuckling his cartridge belt, he handed it to him. "You take this, Rip," he said. "She's a hair trigger. Now mind." Rip was suffering from a plethora of guns. What with his own and his overall bib, he felt like a walking arsenal. But appearances demanded that he take the weapon, and so, thanking Black, he strapped it on. With McGregor and Margrove, he rode back toward the river. At the river, there was nothing to find or to see. Margrove showed McGregor and Rip the spot where he had found Till Summers. There was no tracks on the hard pan, only a dark spot that showed where Summers had bled. Beating along the river bank brought no results. McGregor and Margrove crossed the stream, fording the first channel, emerging on the sandbar and splashing across the second channel. Their search of the opposite bank did not enlighten them, although they covered it carefully. The three spent the remainder of the day along the river, and it was dark when they returned to the hay camp. They left Rip at the camp and rode on to the ranch, telling Black that they would be back as soon as the deputy came out from Trinchera, probably early the next morning. Rip, unsaddling his horse, carried his old saddle over to the bed wagon. As he dumped it in beside Granny Black's saddle, he noticed a strange saddle in the wagon. Rip managed to knock the blanket from this unfamiliar hull and, climbing up to replace the blanket, made a hasty examination. The saddle was fairly new, and while there was no scabbard on it, there was a rubbed spot on the leather on the underside of the right fender, and the rigging showed where straps had held a scabbard in place. Coming back from the wagon to the fire, Rip returned Black's gun, collecting his supper from the Dutch ovens and frying pans that were close to the blaze. He repaired to a spot well away from the others and ate his meal. As he ate, Spanky Cosgrove came over to him. Spanky was full of talk and conjecture. He asked questions and gave his ideas as to what had happened. Rip listened. He had already noted that Gray Cook was in camp, and now he asked a question of his own. "Whose cactus is that in the wagon, Spanky?" queried Rip. "Oh, that's Gray's," answered Spanky. "He came off the mesa while you was out with McGregor." Finishing his supper, Rip dumped his dishes in the dishpan and, rolling a thin smoke, sat down. Spanky came over again and wanted to talk, but Rip had pulled back, deep into his mind. Rip had seen a man shot that day. He had seen Herb Margrove along the river, and Margrove carried a rifle in a saddle. He had seen Ian McGregor come out of the river bottom, and McGregor, too, carried a rifle, and he had seen a saddle, Gray Cook's saddle, that showed where a rifle scabbard had been fastened under the fender. Who was it? McGregor? Margrove? Cook? Or some unknown? How should he know? Rip asked himself crossly. What business was it of his? He went to bed, still asking himself that question. In the morning, the hay crew went to work. They were almost through with the cutting and stacking of that particular spot, and so Rip told himself, when he looked at the hay that remained to be cut, they should be through by noon and moving on to another meadow. Rip was on top of the stack, rounding it off, when a little party came to the hay camp. McGregor and Margrove and Jack Davis, the deputy sheriff from Trinchera. Besides those three, there was a buckboard with 2 men. One of the men Rip recognized as Jack Bly, and he nearly fell off the stack when he got a good look at the other man. There, sitting beside Bly, dressed in bib overalls and a straw hat, with brogans on his feet, was Bill Walters, erstwhile rider for the Circle P. What in the... Had Meadows sent Walters on the same mission as Rip? What was Walter doing here? Rip got down from the stack. It was finished anyhow, and there wasn't much more hay to come in. Walking across, he joined Ted Daly on another unfinished stack and fell to work again. McGregor and the deputy and Margrove were riding out of camp, bound for the scene of the killing, and Bly and Walters were talking to Granny Black. Granny nodded, and Walters walked around the buckboard and pulled off a bedroll. So Walters was going to be part of the hay crew. A loaded wagon came up, and Rip was busy again. As Rip had thought, they finished by noon. Rip, joining the rest of the crew at the camp, loaded his plate and ate his dinner. Walters was there. He looked sharply at Rip, but apparently didn't recognize him. Rip's beard covered his face in a rusty stubble. His clothing was dirty and his hat battered. Rip devoutly hoped that Walters didn't know him. Still, he couldn't be sure. When the meal was finished, Granny Black gave orders and the camp was loaded. Granny led the way, and the string of loaded wagons moved off toward the river. It took them all afternoon to make the move, and when they arrived at their destination, they found Herb Margrove waiting for them. Black hailed Margrove, and the foreman answered. McGregor and Davis, Margrove said, had gone back to the ranch. He gave no account of his own presence. The new meadow was in the river bottom. The Horseshoe Mesa was 2 miles distant, and the Hardpan Flat perhaps 3 miles. They unloaded, and camp was made beside an old stack yard in which there was still a stack or 2 standing. The remuda was driven off to graze, Margrove riding out with Spanky, and the cook made his fire and began the preparation for supper. Rip, his bed unloaded, looked about for a place to put it. He wasn't going to put it close to Walter's, he knew that. Dragging the bed, he stopped close beside the stackyard fence. As he unrolled it, Granny Black walked over and stood beside him. "Where'd you find those horses, Rip?" he said curtly. Rip, unthinking, told the truth. "Against the pasture fence at the ranch." Black grunted and walked away. Then suddenly Rip recalled that he had told McGregor that he had found the horses on the mesa. Now, Rip wondered, what would come of that? When he and McGregor had brought the horses in, they had come up the river, and that was in the direction just opposite from the Triangle Dot headquarters. Black was no fool. Rip, thinking it over, decided he had certainly spilled his beans. But Black didn't come back, and nothing was said. Spanky came in alone, having been relieved by the Nighthawk, and reported that Margrove had gone on to the ranch. Going to bed well away from the others, Rip undressed and put his gun under his head. There was another gun in the bedroll, the gun Rip had taken from Bill Walters in Denver. Its presence did not make Rip feel any better. If Bill Walters wanted a gun, he'd get one. Rip was certain. As far as Walters was concerned, the .41 Frontier Colt was not the only gun in the world. They sold guns in Denver and in a good many other places. Rip lay down in his bed and let the camp get quiet. When all was peaceful, he sat up, dressed silently, and taking his Colt, rolled under the stackyard fence and crawled to a stack. Haystacks made good beds, according to Rip Campbell, particularly when there was an enemy loose in the camp. Rip found some loose hay at the base of a stack, and, still crawling, prepared to go to sleep on it. As he settled down, he felt something long and hard under him. An exploring hand divulged its identity. It was a rifle in a saddle scabbard. Rip almost yelled when he felt the cold iron of the gun. Here was the weapon that had dropped Till Summers. Rip would have bet on it. He restrained himself. This surely was not the time or the place to come out dragging that gun, and it wasn't the place to make a bet either. Rip crawled off his pile of loose hay. He moved a good distance away, settled himself, and tried to stay awake. Maybe somebody would come to get that rifle. Maybe they would come soon. But cutting and stacking hay is hard work. Rip was tired. Try as he might, after he had listened and watched for so long a time, his eyes closed and he dozed. Periodically he would awake, only to doze again. And so, Rip Campbell did not hear a man come stealing from the camp to the stackyard, nor did he hear him leave. The next morning, Rip got up from his hay pile and crawled over to the stackyard fence to go to the fire. Most of the men were still asleep, but the cook was up, and so was Granny Black. Rip could not avoid Granny's eyes, and he crossed the stackyard fence. Going to the fence from his bed, Rip had made an occasion to walk across the loose hay he had first chosen for a sleeping site. His feet told him that the rifle was gone, and Rip cursed his drowsiness. Granny said nothing as Rip came to the fire, and as the cook was yelling for wood, Rip took the axe and attacked the woodpile. The other men arose, rubbing the sleep from their eyes and putting on their hats as soon as they sat up. Rip looked around and spotted Walters. Walters was getting dressed, and next to him, Ted Daly was getting out of bed, cursing. Hay was cut that morning. At noon, Harvey Little came into the camp and ate dirtier with the crew. Gray had not accompanied the crew on the move from the upper meadow, and Harvey was the first Triangle Dot rider that they had seen since the day before. Accordingly, Little was besieged by questions, which he could not answer. Indeed, the tale of Till Summers' death and the advent of the deputy from Trinchera were news to Little. He had, he explained, gone back from the ranch to the Bend Line camp Sunday evening. Evidently, Little held down the Bend camp and had just spent Sunday at headquarters. He listened avidly to what was told him, but made very little comment. Granny Black did most of the talking, seeming to feel that a cowboy should be talked to by a cowboy, and in the course of the conversation, Granny asked little about fresh meat. Harvey told the man that he had butchered a yearling and would bring over a side, but Granny shook his head. "You'll be back through here this evening on your way to camp," he said. "I'll send a man over with you to get the meat." It was left at that, and Little rode away on the bronc he was working. That afternoon was abominably hot. The hay cut during the morning had cured sufficiently to rake and was now being hauled in. Rip and Ted Daly were stacking, but because of the heat and the thunderheads that were rolling over the mesa, Granny had put them on one stack and they were working together. Rip was preoccupied. He had paid scarcely any attention to Little at noon, for when he had put his bed together before dinner, he had found that the .41 Colt he had taken from Walters was gone. That meant that someone had visited his bed during his absence last night. Rip believed that someone to be Walters, but he couldn't be sure. He would have bet that had he been in the bed, he wouldn't have awakened in the morning, but that was conjecture. As far as Walter was concerned, he had made no sign that he knew of Rip or that he was aware of his existence. The racks came in to the stack, and their loads were pitched off. Granny was not getting any more hay down, and that meant that he thought that it would rain. It also meant that Rip and Daly had plenty to work. Walters and his partner brought a rack up and stopped. The man who had been helping Walters load was driving, and back of the rack, Walters leaned on his fork. There was a grin on the driver's face. Rip, hot and sweaty, didn't pay much attention to the grin. It might have been well if he had. There can be a good deal of horseplay in a Granger camp, and when there is horseplay, it's rough. The driver was grinning because in loading the rack, he and Walters found a 5-foot-long diamondback rattler under the shock. Walters had deterred his partner from killing the snake. "We'll load him on," Walters said. "Then we'll pitch him off to the boys on the stack and have some fun." The other man had agreed. Accordingly, when the load was finished, they had returned for the snake, caught it with a fork, and pitched it up. At the moment he was on top of the load, caught between the tines of the fork upon which Walters so nonchalantly leaned, Rip was at the front of the stack. The team stopped so that the rear of the wagon was opposite Rip, and Walters gave his fork an extra shove to load the implement, caught the handle well up, and pitched hurriedly. Rip caught a flash of something in the air that was not hay. He heard the buzz of the snake and stabbed out with his fork to deflect the descending hay. He knew that there was a snake coming down, and he didn't intend to be under it. At the same time, Walters yelled, "Look out, snake!" And Ted Daly, further back on the stack, sprang forward. Rip had sent the forkful of hay and the snake toward the side of the stack with his hurried lunge. The hay, always slippery underfoot, slid with him, and he went down, losing his fork as he fell. Daly, his fork uplifted, was lunging forward, and Rip's astonished eyes read murder in Daly's face. There was no time to think of snakes now. Rattlers are bad enough, but they're not quite as certain as a 5-tined fork driven by a brawny arm. Rip tried to roll, and again hay slid, and Rip was cascading with it over the edge of the stack, while Daly, unable to stop his lunge, brought his fork down into the spot where Rip had lain. Over on the wagon, Walters and his partner were laughing at the confusion they had caused. The snake had slid off the edge of the stack, and a man coming up with another rack of hay had halted his team, leaping down, and was now killing the snake. Rip Campbell, hitting the ground, found his leg bent under him. He was scarcely able to rise. Granny Black was running into the stackyard swearing. It didn't take Granny long to read the riot act to Walters and the other man on the rack. His talk was short and to the point. "Another stunt like that," vowed Granny, "and the two of you be walking to Trinchera." In the meantime, Daly had come down from the stack and was helping Rip to his feet. "I sure tried to get that rattler before he got to you," said Daly earnestly. "Hell, He was 6 feet long, it looked like. That was a fine joke to play, pitching a snake up on the stack. If he'd have bit you, it would have been so long and no mistake. The man spoke so earnestly, seemed so sincere, that Rip almost believed him. Still, he had seen Daly's face and the uplifted fork, and he had seen those bright tines flash down even as Rip slid from the stack. But Daly was helping Rip up and brushing him off, and Rip could hardly accuse him of attempted murder. The incident had been a practical joke and an accident to all appearances, and Rip could not be sure that it wasn't. When Granny Black came around the stack, Rip was limping over to pick up his fork, and apparently the whole thing was over. "I told them two that I'd fire them if they tried another stunt like that," said Granny. "Now you drop it, Rip. Don't you go jump them. Sabe?" He jabbed out a finger. Rip made no reply. Limping over to the stack, he stuck his fork in the side, preparing to climb to the top. Daly was already on top and holding out his hand to help Rip. Granny watched the man anxiously as Rip went up. Granny didn't want trouble on the hay crew, but unless he was mistaken, this Rip boy wasn't going to drop the matter as it stood. In fact, Granny would have been disappointed if Rip had dropped the matter. Rip Campbell had become a favorite with the fat little boss of the Granger wagon. The crew managed to finish the stack before the rain began. With the rainfall, haying coming to a standstill, and the crew went to camp. Rip was slow in getting in because of his lame leg. When he did arrive, he found Walters and Daly under a wagon with some others. The men with Walters were chuckling over something, and as Rip limped up, the laughter ceased. Rip squatted down so that he could look under the wagon, the rain dripping from his straw hat and beating soddenly on his shoulders. "No more snakes," he said, quietly, looking Walters in the eye. "Try it another way next time, and be sure you make a job of it." Walters' face paled a little under Rip's stare. Then he turned to the man who sat beside him and spoke. Rip, his warning issued, had straightened up and was limping toward his bed. Camp was miserable in the rain. The wind blew gusts across the campsite, and the men got under the wagons or sought what shelter they could find, there to look out at the storm, pull the wet clothing away from their bodies, and roll cigarettes with moist fingers. Under the canvas fly that had been rigged for a sunshade, the cook was busy moving around the fire, trying to get away from the smoke that seemed to flow wherever he went, swearing at the weather and at the wet wood that refused to burn. Rip Campbell, under the shelter of a rack, sat and sucked at his damp smoke and stared out at the scene, while under the bed wagon, Daly spoke to Walters, for the two were now alone. "He's slippery as an eel," said Daly. "I was sure I had him with the fork, but he rolled off the edge of the stack. Why didn't you say you was going to bring in a snake and throw it up?" "Because I didn't know I was going to," answered Walter. "It was just a chance. If you'd got him with the fork—" His voice trailed off. "What did Bly say?" demanded Daly. "When's he coming out?" "As soon as he gets the money for the steers," answered Walters. "And he's got something on his mind besides that. We won't be pitching hay for long, Ted." "It was a fool idea to do it at all, if you ask me," returned Daly irritably. "Why didn't Bly let us go to this place and hole up? Why did he want us out here working like dogs?" "I don't know." Walters looked across the wagon under which Rip sat. "Bly's deep. There ain't nobody going to be looking hard at a ranger crew, and men can drift in and out. It gives a man an excuse to be in the country. Bly's got something up his sleeve. He's slick, Bly is." "Have you heard Granny say anything?" "Not a word." "Well," Walter shrugged, "he'll talk before long, or I miss my guess. Ted, that sun over there under the wagon is dangerous. I told Bly he was when I'd seen him here, and Bly just grunted. We made 2 tries at him last night and today. I found the gun he took off in Denver in his bedroll. I took it." "You fool," grated Daly. "Now he'll be looking out." "He won't be looking out long," vowed Walters. Next time I ain't gonna be joking. Daly squinted meditatively. Maybe there won't be a next time, he said. I wish I had my money from them steers and was out of here. Chapter 6. The rain held. Not a hard, vicious rain, but a steady downpour. About 6 o'clock, when the cook had supper ready, Harvey Little, covered with a slicker, came into the hay camp. He ate with the crew under the cook's tent, sitting well out because, as he said, a little more rain ain't gonna make much difference to this slicker. When the meal was over, Little said he had to get along to camp, and again volunteered to bring over the side of beef. Granny Black was about to accept the offer when Rip interposed. I got a poncho in my bed, Mr. Black, he said. I don't mind riding over and bringing back a quarter. Granny looked at Rip, shrugged, seemed about to veto the suggestion, then changed his mind. All right, he said. You go get what you want to. The horses will be in a minute. Granny's prediction was correct. Within a short time, Spanky Cosgrove brought the horses in and threw them into the rope corral. Harvey, his rope wet and stiff, managed to catch a horse for Rip, and stood by while Rip got the poncho from his bedding and saddled. Then the two rode away, Rip to return in the morning with the beef. The two talked little on the way to the camp. It was quite a piece down the river, across the hard pan. The rain beat on them steadily, and Rip, already wet through, rode in silence. It was dark by the time the two had crossed the hard pan, and Little, turning in a saddle, said, "Camp, 2 buildings, a house and a shed," cheerfully. "Not much further now, I'll bet," and stopped. "You go on into the house. You'll be plenty glad to dry out," said Little. "I'll throw the horses in the corral." He led them over to the smaller circular pen and then opened the corral gate. Horses passed into the corral. "I ran in the morning," nodded Rip, and followed Little. When they opened the door, the room appeared deserted. A lamp burned on the table, and another darkened door told of a room beyond. Little and Rip stepped through, closed the door behind them, and then turned again to his companion. Little grunted. Somebody holed up in the camp," he said. "Somebody's been here sure enough," said Rip. "Well, it won't make any difference," he said. Went off and left the light burn. "There's 3 beds anyhow, and they'll be in, why—" Rip, turning, followed Little's eyes. The youngster was looking at a rifle in a sheath that stood in a corner. "What's the matter?" asked Rip. "A carbine," said Little. "Somebody took it a month ago, and here it is." Laughter swallowed the rest of his words. 2 girls, one dark, the other fair, came bubbling with laughter from the dark door of the other room. Charlotte McGregor and Burl White. "Surprise, surprise!" called Charlotte. Indeed, it was a surprise. Harvey Little recoiled a step, and a grin widened on his face. "Well, what in the world?" he began. "Burl and I went out for a ride," explained Charlotte. "We rode up on the mesa, and I said, wouldn't it be fun if we came down to see you? So we did, and the rain caught us. We're going to stay all night. You'll have to sleep in the barn." "But your dad," expostulated Harvey. "What'll he say, and what'll your mother think?" "Oh, Dad and Mom have gone to Trinchera and won't be back till tomorrow," answered Charlotte. "And it'll be perfectly proper anyway. I'll chaperone Beryl, and she'll chaperone me." There were more arguments on the tip of Harvey's tongue, but he stilled them. Rip, looking at the boy, could see eagerness and perhaps longing in his eyes. Harvey Little was in love with Charlotte McGregor. Rip would have bet his saddle on that. And looking at the girl, he wasn't at all sure that she was not in love with Little. It was then that Harvey thought of his guest. Gravely and courteously, he introduced Rip. The girls nodded. Rip said that he was pleased to meet them. Both men now stripped off their raincoats. Rip putting his poncho on a hook and Harvey hanging a slicker beside it. The girls had built a fire in the little sheet iron stove, and Rip, standing beside the stove, turned his body until first one side and then the other side of his clothing steamed. The conversation in the shack was lively. Rip was disregarded, left out, but that suited him. Harvey was chided for not being at home when his guest arrived. There were jokes made at his expense, and he was kidded unmercifully, all of which he seemed to enjoy. Later, the talk took a more serious tone. "Burrow's going back to school with me next year," announced Charlotte McGregor. "Her mother sold her brand, and now she can go." "Your mother sold the cross in a box?" asked Harvey. "I thought she'd keep that." Burl White laughed. "She sold it," she said. "I thought that she'd keep it too. I didn't think anyone would buy it, but Mr. Percy wanted it for some reason or other and gave Mama $600 for the brand and what cattle there were." Harvey Little was frowning. "There wasn't more than 8 or 10 head of cross in a box left," he said. $600 seemed mighty big money for that. "Maybe he wanted to send Burl to school to get her out of the way," laughed Charlotte. "Mr. Bly has been mighty attentive to Mrs. White, in the last few months." "Charlotte," said Burl White indignantly, and both Charlotte and Harvey Little laughed. The talk went on. Generalities, mention of dances past and in the future, one thing and another. Rip yawned. After all, he had had a hard day. That yawn brought the others to a realization of the time. Harvey said good night to the girls, told Rip to come with him, and the two men, donning their raincoats again and taking a lantern, went out to bed down in the barn. There, as they made ready for the night, Rip asked a question. "That, cross-in-a-box brand," he said, "how's it put on?" There was dust on the board floor of the barn loft where the two were standing, and Harvey Little bent down and drew a diagram in the dust. "Like this," he said, "on the right hip." "Oh, I'm going back to the house a minute. There's something I forgot." Leaving the lantern, he went down the ladder from the loft. Rip bent over the pattern traced in the dust. "So," drawled Rip Campbell softly, "like that, on the right hip." Beside the pattern Little had traced, Rip drew another, and then staring at the two, a third, he looked down at them. "Cross in a box, triangle dot, and circle P. I'd kind of like to have a brand like that myself," said Rip softly. "Anyhow, in this country." Harvey Little returned from the house with 2 blankets, one of which he tossed to Rip. There was a faraway, bright look in Harvey's eyes. His hat was pushed back, and there was rain on his cheeks. Rip grinned. A man doesn't walk in the rain with his hat pushed back unless he is considerably perturbed, and Rip had reason to believe that Harvey had not gone back to the house solely for the blankets. Both men undressed, and Rip hung his still damp clothes over a rafter where they might dry somewhat. Wrapping themselves in the 2 blankets, the 2 men lay down on the musty hay, and Little blew out the light. A call from outside awakened Rip Campbell. Someone was calling. "Little! Little!" And the rain was still dripping soddenly on the roof. It was still dark, so black in the loft that Rip could not see his hand when he reached out of his blanket. A match flamed, and Harvey Little touched the flame to the lantern wick. "What is it?" called Harvey. The voice came again from outside. "This is Margrove. Put your clothes on and come on down here." By lantern light, the two in the loft hurriedly dressed. Then, with Poncho covering Rip and Slicker covering Harvey, the two went down the ladder and out of the barn. There was a light in the house showing that the girls were up, and in front of the barn there were 3 men on horses. As the lantern light reflected the wetness of the group, Rip recognized Herb Margrove, Granny Black, and Jack Davis, the deputy from Chinchera. "What's up, Margrove?" asked Little. It was Jack Davis that answered that question. "Come on in the house, Harvey," said Davis solemnly. "We want to talk to you." In the house, the girls showed their frightened faces through the bedroom door. Jack Davis was uneasy. He glanced at the girls, back to Little, and then at the lamp at the table. "Where were you day before yesterday, Harvey?" asked Davis. "Why?" Little considered the question. "Well, I rode below here that day, Jack. Rode bog along the river. What's the matter?" Davis walked over and picked up the carbine that stood sheathed in the corner of the room. "Your gun?" he asked, looking at Little. Harvey nodded. "Funny, too," he said. "That gun's been gone for a month, pretty near. Then, when Rip and me come in this evening, it was standing there in the corner. What's this all about, Jack?" "It's all about this," said Jack Davis. "Till Summers was killed day before yesterday. Somebody bushwhacked him out on the hardpan. And you come down here to ask me about it." Little's voice was level. Jack Davis brought a spent shell from his pocket. Slowly, he slid the carbine from its sheath and, opening the breech, lifted the gun until he looked down the barrel at the light. "It's fouled," he said, to no one in particular. "I done more than come down to ask you, Harvey. I'm going to take you back with me in the morning, back to Trinchera. You see, you bought the last box of UMC cartridges that Bly had at his store, and—" he paused. "This shell was found in the willows by the hardpan. It's the shell that killed Summers, and it's a UMC." He held out the bit of metal. "But that gun was stolen, I tell you," exclaimed Little. "It was just brought back tonight. Hell, Jack, you think I killed Summers? Why would I want to kill him?" "I don't know," said Davis slowly. "Summers was a stock detective that the association sent in here. We looked at his papers. I don't know why you'd kill him, but your gun's been shot, and it's got UMC shells in it, and Summers was killed with a UMC. I'm going to take you in." "I tell you, that gun was taken," reiterated Little. "It was just brought back tonight." "Why, Jack," Margrove interrupted, "that's an old stall, Little," he said gruffly while he was grinning. Harvey Little wheeled and faced the foreman. "So it was you that brought Jack out," he said. "I didn't think that you'd go that far with it, Margrove. I sure didn't." Margrove opened his mouth to speak, his face flushing angrily. Then he thought better of the idea and closed his mouth again. There was something between Herb Margrove and Harvey Little. Rip saw. He wondered what it was. His eyes followed Margrove's look, and Rip saw that the Triangle Dot foreman was watching the girls in the doorway. So that was it. Herb Margrove was in love with Charlotte McGregor, and he was getting rid of Harvey Little's competition. Granny Black shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He, too, was looking at the door. "We better make some coffee," said Granny. "You girls get dressed and come on out here. Charlotte, you ought to be spanked running off from home this way." "We were caught by the rain," Charlotte said defensively, glaring at Herb. "Well," said Granny, "you go get dressed now." It seemed as though morning would never come. The men sat around the little room. Granny squatting beside Rip, who in turn squatted against the wall. Jack Davis tried to get Harvey Little to talk, but Little had shut up like a clam. He simply stared at Margrove, and Margrove could not abide that stare. The Triangle Dot foreman moved uneasily around the room and talked to Granny and Jack Davis. The girls, dressed, had come from the bedroom, and Charlotte McGregor had walked defiantly over and seated herself beside Harvey Little. When morning finally came, Margrove went out to look after the horses, while Granny Black prepared a meager breakfast. Rip went out when Margrove departed, and he watched the foreman ride out into the horse pasture after mounts. Margrove, Rip noticed, did not have a rifle in his saddle. When breakfast was finished, Harvey Little, under Davis's supervision, put a few possessions in his war sack for the ride into Trinchera. "We might as well go," said the deputy. They filed out of the house. Rip, not forgetting his errand, went to the meat safe back of the house, Granny Black accompanying him. There was a fresh beef in the meat safe, a small beef that had been split. They quartered the meat and finding sacks, wrapped the quarters, and carried them around the house to where the horses were tied. "You might as well take one of these, Harvey," said Granny. "And you can take one, Herb." Accordingly, with Black, Rip, Little, and Margrove each carrying a quarter of beef to their saddle, the little procession started. The rain had stopped, and the morning was bright. Chapter 7. When the little party of horsemen came to the hard pan, Rip noticed a string of cattle coming down from the mesa, cattle going to the water. Margrove, who rode beside Rip, also saw the cattle. "I want to take a look at that bunch," he said. "Take the meat, Rip." When he reached the cattle, they were almost at the river. They lined up along the riverbank drinking, and Margrove waited. The others drew closer and then turned a little toward the mesa. The river was high because of the rain. Margrove, when the cattle had drunk, separated 3 cows from the others and pushed them into the channel. The cattle swam, quartering across the stream and heading toward the sandbar that barely showed because of the high water. The animals went downstream a long distance and then emerged on the bar and stood there, water lapping at their feet. Then a cow stepped off into the other channel and pushed across, and the other 2 followed her. Margrove came loping back. "Bligh's cattle," he explained. "I shoved them over to this side of the river." Rip was silent. A great light had suddenly dawned upon the young rider. So that was where the Circle P steers had gone. Rip cursed himself for a simpleton. Of course, the Circle P's had run. They had split up against the mesa, and the bunch that had gone toward the Malapayas had been picked up by the riders who were waiting for them. It was as simple as that. The riders had held the steers on the Malapayas and driven them down the slope to the hard pan. No tracks on the Malapayas. It was too hard. So hard that not even a shod horse would leave much sign. Then, when the Malapayas broke into the hard pan, the riders had again held the steers close. No tracks on the hard pan either. The hard pan went into the river, and by working on the shallow water at the edge of the canyon, the thieves had held the cattle in the water and drifted them downstream out to the sandbar and on across. Naturally, the steers had spread out and come out of the water singly and a long distance downstream. No wonder that the Circle P riders had sworn that those 400 head of big steers had sprouted wings. There just hadn't been any chance for a slip. The question of how the steers had gone was answered. But there was other questions. Somebody had started the Circle P herd to running. Someone who was hooked up in this country, who knew that there were riders waiting to take advantage of the run, who knew the country, and someone who had been at the herd when it ran. That left 3 people: Chuck Blossom, Combe Andrews, and Bill Walters. Chuck Blossom was either in Denver or on their trail back to San Angelo. Chuck was out. Bill Walters was working at the Triangle Dodge Granger wagon, and Combe Andrews was missing. Combe had gone to the herd that night. Rip had heard him leave camp, and Combe had picked the bed ground. Maybe Combe was the man. But here was Walters, dressed up like a Granger and chummy with Ted Daly, and Walters and Daly had tried to kill Rip. That snake business had been no accident. Walters' gun was gone, too. Rip stared straight ahead and forgot to ride like a farmer. He was too busy thinking of other things. When the riders reached the hay camp, Margrove had a surprise for Granny. "I'm going to be short-handed," he said abruptly. "Summer's dead. Little is going to jail, and Gray Cook quit yesterday. I want to take a man from yours, Granny." "Cook quit?" said Black. "How come?" "Want to work for Bly," said Margrove. "Bly's moving some stuff. I like to have Spanky." "Well, I'll be durned," announced Granny. "Spanky, of all—" "He's been wanting to work for me a time," interrupted Margrove. "I'm going to try him out. I can always fire him, you know. Send out for him, will you?" There was nothing for Granny to do but give in. The cow work came first, and the cow boss clearly superseded the Granger foreman. Granny looked around. "You go out to the corral and send Spanky in," he said sourly to Rip. "You can wrangle horses, I reckon." Rip nodded and, mounting his horse, rode out of camp. The corral was a mile down the river. Rip and Granny had seen the horses as they rode toward camp. Rip found Spanky and gave him the message. Spanky grinned, thanked Rip, and started his horse toward the hay camp. Before he had gone 10 feet, he had the horse at a lope. Left alone with the remuda, Rip rolled a cigarette and squinted an eye at the sky. So Gray Cook was working for Bly. Cocking one leg over the horn of his saddle, Rip pondered. Mentally, he came at length to what had occurred that morning. Margrove shoving the cattle into the river. The river had been up, and Rip wondered why Margrove had put the cattle across the stream, swollen as it was. He hadn't seen the brands on those cattle. Maybe Margrove hadn't wanted anyone to see them. Rip wished that he might see the crossing again. Why shouldn't he? He was free from camp, and certainly the horses were mobile. It wasn't far to the hard pan, not more than 2 miles. Rip put his loose foot back in the stirrup and, circling his horses, started them toward the river. At the edge of the hard pan, he left the corral and rode on. The horses would work back toward camp, he knew, and they wouldn't leave the bottom. It'd be no trick to pick them up as he returned. Out on the hard pan, he stopped and tried to find where the cattle Margrove had driven entered the river. He couldn't find the place. The water was going down rapidly and was not nearly so high as it had been. Rip looked out and saw the top of the sandbar, and on the sandbar was a black object. Probably a snag washed down by the high water and stranded on the bar. Still, it might be something else. Curiosity prompted Rip. He kicked his horse off into the channel. The channel was deep, and the horse had to swim a few yards. The water shallowed again, and Rip splashed along. He reached the sandbar, and with his pony feet sinking into the soft sand, rode 100 yards downstream. His eyes widened, and his face grew white beneath its tan. There, emerging from the sand, was the arm and shoulder of a man. For a little time, Rip sat and looked at the thing he had found. Then, dismounting, he kicked at the wet sand until the shoulder and neck and head of the body were exposed. The face was bloated, swollen out of all recognition, but there was no mistake in the clothing. The brown neckerchief and the gray shirt with a little notebook, pulped now, protruding from the pocket. This was Combe Andrews. No question now as to who had started the cattle on their run. No question at all. Rip looked back toward the hay camp, invisible some 3 miles up the river. "Damn you," he almost yelled. After a few moments, he brought himself back to facts. He couldn't leave the body where it was. Another rise in the stream might send it miles away with the current. How should he dispose of it? There was a saddle rope on the saddle, and Rip uncoiled it and fastened the loop about the rigid arm. Then, mounting, he set his horse back, and the body came out of the sand with a sucking, sickening sound. Towing all that remained of Combe Andrews, Rip started back toward the hard pan. He slid it over the hard pan until he reached the mesa. There, among the broken malapais rock, he freed the rope and piled the rock chunks of lava over Combe Andrews. Rip mounted again and started back upriver, and when he reached the edge of the hard pan, found a grazing horse. The sight of the animal restored some sanity to Rip. He could not ride back to the hay camp, call Bill Walters out, and invite him to defend himself. That would not do. Rip had no doubt that Walters had killed Combe Andrews, but there had been other men with Walters, and behind Walters was a cunning brain that had planned it all out. Rip was sure of that, too. Gradually, his flaming anger subsided into a cold, hard rage. His mind was ice cold and ice hard. He would find the man who was behind it all, the man who had planned the theft and who profited most by it. That man would pay, and then he, Rip Campbell, would collect justly from Bill Walters. Rip swung his mount to pick up the grazing horse, and driving the animal, headed toward the others of the loosely scattered remuda. With the bell on and old gray mare tinkling, Rip drove the cob back up the river. Toward noon, when the sun was high overhead, Granny came out for Rip. The hay had dried enough to cut, and he wanted the horses brought in. The two hazed the remuda toward camp and threw the horses into the rope corral. Smoke went straight up from the fire, and the men of the crew were eating dinner. Rip went over and joined them. While they ate, the cook talked to Granny, and when the meal was done, Black came over to Rip. "Get a team for Cookie. Drive to the ranch this evening," he said shortly. "He needs some grub." Rip nodded. Rising, he put his plate and cup in the dishpan and walked over to get his horse. He still limped a little from his fall from the stack. His path led him close to where Walters and Daly were sitting. As Rip passed, Walters, a grin on his face, pursed his lips and buzzed. The sound was almost that of a snake, and Rip wheeled. As he looked down at Walters, his rage overcame him. One strong brown hand reached down and seized Walter's shoulder. Rip jerked the man to his feet and flung him away. Walters recovered his balance. "Damn you!" he roared and leaped at Rip. If Walters had tried for his gun, Rip would have killed him in that instant. But Walters did not try. His fists were swinging as he leaped in, and one big fist struck Rip's head and made him reel. In another instant, the two were clenched, and Walters was bringing up a knee to Rip's groin. But Rip, recovering from the blow, arched his back, and the blow did not go home. Rip's left hand was sunk in Walter's neck, and his right swung short, chopping blows that spatted viciously. Then those chopping blows ceased. The right hand joined at Walter's throat and stayed there. Clawing, kicking, swinging futile blows, Walter tried to break that grip, but the hands clung leash-like. Walter's struggles weakened. Gradually, he bent back until at length his knees gave way and he fell. His purply face turned up to the sky, and Rip Campbell, his face contorted, sank his fingers deeper and deeper into the man's relaxing throat. It was Granny Black who stopped Rip. Granny who caught his arm and sent Rip rolling from Walters. Rip scrambled to his feet. His eyes were still dark with rage. "Stop it!" snapped Granny Black. "Stop it, Rip!" Gradually, the red veil lifted from Rip's eyes, and he could see the men in the camp again. Daly stood with his hand over the bib of his overalls. Walters was on the ground, his mouth open and his chest heaving as he struggled for breath. Granny Black stood, legs spread apart, facing Rip. "Because a man buzzes at you like a snake is no sign you gotta kill him," snapped Black. "You're through. You can go to the ranch with Cookie this evening. Maybe McGregor will send you in from there." Rip nodded dully. The rage was running out of him in a flood. He felt weak. Daly took his hand from the bib of his overalls and walked to where Walters lay. Bending down, he lifted the man so that Walters could breathe more easily. "Get your bedding and put it in the wagon," Black ordered Rip. "I'll give you a note to McGregor and he'll pay you." Rip, collecting himself, walked over to where his bed lay and slowly began to put it together. Chapter 8. Half an hour later, bearing a note to McGregor, Rip rode out of the hay camp, sitting beside the cook on the spring seat of the wagon. Spanky Cosgrove's bedding bumped beside Rip's bedroll in the back of the wagon. He was, Rip decided, well content to go. There was not much more that he could do with the Granger wagon. Now, Rip felt, he needed to be free. He must inform Jack Davis and Trinchera of the discovery of Combe Andrews' body. Also, he must write of that discovery to High Meadows. He would send 2 letters, Rip decided, one to Denver and one to San Angelo. He would be sure to catch Meadows at one place or the other. The cook was smoking a pipe. The strong fumes of the tobacco crinkled Rip's nostrils, and in self-defense he reached for his own makings. As he rolled his smoke, the cook spoke. "Writer, ain't you?" said the cook. "What makes you think so?" "Yeah, I've been one," answered the cook. "You aim to kill that fella?" "Maybe." The cook puffed, spat, and eyed. "Too bad." "What?" asked Rip. "Too bad you didn't." The cook spat again. Rip thought that over. He waited for the cook to continue, but the cook had pumped his well dry. Gradually, Rip retired into his own mind. Grimly there he ticked off facts. First, he knew where the steers had gone. They had gone across the river. He knew who had killed Combe Andrews, Bill Walters. He knew, too, who had handled the steers, or at least he believed he knew. The brands that he had drawn in the dust on the barn floor were pretty good proof to Rip that Jake Bly was the Bill Walters man who handled the cattle. Jake Bly had bought the cross in the box, and the Circle P could be run into a dandy cross in the box. Here Rip scowled. The brands were enough evidence to Rip, but they might not be to anyone else. Save for getting the Circle P steers or collecting for them, Rip's job was done. And yet, somehow, he didn't feel that it was done. A sentimental fool, Rip told himself. Just a crying old woman. But Harvey Little was in jail in Trinchera, and Charlotte McGregor loved Harvey. Rip liked Harvey himself, until Summers had been killed, and there was a confusion of rifles around the Granger camp. With a start, Rip recalled that Margrove had not been carrying a rifle in his saddle that morning, whereas he had been sure when Rip had first seen him. Might as well see the thing through," he said to himself, the words small in his mouth. "What's that?" demanded the cook. Nothing," said Rip Campbell. When the two arrived at the Triangle Dot, the cook halted the wagon in the yard and both men got down from the seat. As they started toward the house, the door was flung violently open and Charlotte McGregor came out. She flung herself across the porch and down the steps and turned to face McGregor, who had appeared in the doorway. "I don't care what you say," said the girl angrily, flinging the words at her father. "I'm going to Trinchera, and I'm going to marry Harvey. He didn't do it. What would he shoot a man for? He hasn't been stealing your cattle." "Come back here," commanded McGregor, his face red with anger. But the girl was striding away from the house. Rip coughed, and McGregor, turning his head, saw the two men for the first time. "What do you want?" The cook spat. "I come in for some grub," he said laconically. "I reckon I'll go to the cook shack." He turned and limped away. "Well?" said McGregor, staring at Rip. "Black sent me in for my time," said Rip. "Here's a note." McGregor took the piece of paper that Rip extended and glanced at it. "Fightin', huh?" he snapped. "I've a good mind to take it out of you. You Grangers think that you can come and raise hob with a man's outfit. McGregor was mad, Rip realized, but Rip himself was not in the best of temper. "You got a sight better mind to set down and ride out my time," he drawled. Hot black eyes met eyes with gold flecks in them, and McGregor was the first to look away. "I'm kind of sore," he said apologetically. "You go to the bunkhouse and stay for the night. I'll take you into town in the morning. I got something else to look after right now." With that, he came down from the porch and, taking the same direction that Charlotte had taken, hurried away. Rip walked to the wagon, got his bedroll, and went on into the bunkhouse. Instead of going around to the old rock building, he entered the new cabin that the riders used. There he dumped his bed on the floor and, walking over to the packing box, sat down. About 5 o'clock, the Triangle Dot riders began to come in. Spanky Cosgrove was the first to arrive. He still wore shoes and bib overalls, but he swaggered when he came through the door and hailed Rip. Rip answered the greeting, and when they had talked a few moments, got up and went out. When he returned, Spanky had his bed unrolled. Rip went back to his box and sat down, his roving eyes fixed on a scabbard rifle standing in a corner, and rising, Rip walked over and picked up the gun. It hadn't been there when he had left. "Nice gun," he said to Spanky. "Whose is it?" "Margrove's," said Spanky, a tinge of uneasiness in his voice. "Why?" "Don't see many 45-40s anymore," answered Rip, sliding the weapon out of the scabbard. "I always liked them." "Herb's touchy about his gun," said Spanky. "Better put it up." Rip returned the weapon to the scabbard and set it back in the corner. Further talk was cut off by the arrival of other riders. They took Rip's present silently, saying nothing. One by one they came in. Margrove was the last to arrive, and when they were all in, the cook called for supper. When Rip left the bunkhouse, he noted that the hay camp cook had left with the wagon. Rip took his place at the table, saying nothing to the others, ate his food, and after the meal stepped back over the bench and went outside. There, while he rolled a smoke, Margrove came up to him. "Quit black, Rip?" "Fired," Rip answered. Margrove paused a moment and then spoke again. "Bly will be cutting hay now," he said. "You might get on with him." "Well, thanks." Rip strolled away. Spanky Cosgrove was at the corner of the bunkhouse, and Rip joined him there. Apparently some of the taint of the Granger still clung to Spanky, for the other riders left him alone. The two were by themselves, and Rip, squatting on his heels, looked up at the young fella. "Spanky," he drawled, "when did you bring Margrove's rifle into the ranch?" Spanky was caught unprepared by the question. "This morning," he began, and then, "I did bring Margrove's rifle in. Don't lie, Spanky. There's hay in the scabbard of that rifle. It was hid in the old stack at the hay camp. I felt it the night we moved in there. You got it out of that stack, Spanky. Margrove told you to. You put it in your bed, and when you brought your bed in, you unloaded it and put it in the corner." "Well, what if I did?" snapped Spanky. "Nothing," drawled Rip softly. "It just makes you an accessory to murder, that's all. They hang a man for that out here." Spanky's gasp told Rip that the words had gone home. "You keep your mouth shut and say nothing, and I'll keep mine shut," said Rip. "I ain't talking, but if you tell Margrove, I ain't tell nobody," Spanky said earnestly. "I sure won't." "You'd be a fool if you did." Rick got up. "Well, good night, Spanky," he said, his voice kindly. "Sleep good." Rip was grinning as he walked away. He could imagine how well Spanky Cosgrove would sleep. Spanky wouldn't sleep at all unless Rip was mistaken. Well, that couldn't be helped. Rip had the information that he wanted. It looked to Rip Campbell very much as though Herb Margrove was the man that had killed Till Summers. Rip slept with the others in the bunkhouse that night, and while Spanky tossed and turned the night through, Rip lay quietly, awake, thinking. In the morning, after breakfast, McGregor came out and told Rip that he would leave for town shortly. When the buckboard stopped at the bunkhouse for Rip and his bedroll, McGregor, face stern, was occupying the seat beside Charlotte. The girl was subdued, and her eyes showed signs of weeping. Rip loaded his bed, climbed in the back. McGregor started the team moving. For the first few miles there was silence on the seat of the buckboard, and then McGregor spoke. "I'm not giving Harvey's bond because you're in love with him, Charlotte," he said gravely. "I'm going in because no man can say that I've ever let a man of mine down. Jack Davis has—" "Jack Davis is Bly's man," snapped the girl. "I wouldn't believe him any more than I'd believe Jake Bly. You know yourself that you told Mother and me that you thought Jake Bly wasn't honest. You were—" "I know nothing of Bly's honesty," said McGregor. I do know that when he bought the cross-in-the-box brand from Mrs. White, he laid himself open to suspicion. I've written to Denver and to Pueblo and other points to see if there been a cross-in-the-box cattle marketed. If I find out there been, then I'll talk to Jake Bly. There were only a few heads of cross-in-the-box cattle, and Alan White stopped using the brand before he died. Now, I've told you more than I meant, Charlotte. Apparently, Ian McGregor recalled Rip's presence for the first time. He looked back over his shoulder. Rip had closed his eyes when McGregor stopped talking. To all appearances, Rip was asleep. So Ian McGregor had seen what could be done with the cross-in-the-box brand, had he? That accounted for the presence of Till Summers on the triangle dot. Well, he'd show McGregor something else that could be done with the cross-in-a-box. Then the thought flashed into Rip's mind that McGregor had written for information to Pueblo and to Denver. That information might be valuable to McGregor, but it would be doubly valuable to Rip. He must disclose his identity to get that information, but Rip wasn't ready now to say just who he was. When the buckboard reached Trinchilla and stopped before Bly's store, McGregor got down and shook Rip's shoulder. Rip, yawning, seemed to waken. "I'll pay you off," said McGregor curtly. "Here." He brought bills from his pocket and, detaching several, laid them out. "Here's your wages," he said. Rip took the money, said, "Thanks," gruffly, and then asked, "You gonna be in town long, McGregor?" "I don't know," answered McGregor. "I won't leave before noon. Why?" "Well, I maybe tried to get another job," asked Rip, "and I'd like to have you for a reference." McGregor grunted at that and, turning, walked up the street toward a small cottage before which hung a little sign. The sign read, L.M. Higgins, M.D., and Justice of the Peace. Charlotte McGregor was already standing at the gate below the sign. Rip watched McGregor join his daughter and saw the two walk to the cottage. When McGregor and Charlotte had disappeared into the cottage, Rip turned. There was a barber shop half a block down the street. Rip walked over. Inside the little building, the barber quit a game of dominoes and stepped behind his chair. Rip shook his head. "Bath first," he said. "Then I'll get the works. Haircut and a shave. Say, I got 2 bundles down in Bly's warehouse. What's the chances of getting one of you to bring them here?" Coins clinked suggestively in Rip's pocket as he spoke. "I'll go get them," an idle loafer said eagerly. "You got a check or something for them?" Rip held out 2 pieces of pasteboard and a silver dollar. "That'll be fine," he said. "Here's the stubs off the tags. You bring them here." "The bathroom's in the back," said the barber. "There's clean towels inside." "And that'll be fine, too," said Rip, moving toward the door the barber had indicated. "Just throw that canvas sack inside when you get it here." The idler nodded, and Rip, stepping through, closed the bathroom door. An hour and 15 minutes later, Rip Campbell emerged from the barber shop. Rip the Granger hand had gone in. Rip Campbell, bright-eyed, clean-shaven, and rusty locks trimmed, stepped out. "I'll leave my saddle here for a while," he said to the barber, and the barber, his eyes still wide at the metamorphosis, nodded. Boots kicking up little clouds of dust, Rip went up the street. When he came to Bly's store, he hesitated. McGregor's buckboard was still standing in front of the store. Rip turned to enter, and at that moment McGregor, accompanied by Charlotte and Harvey Little, came out. The girl's hand was tucked possessively through Little's arm, and she was smiling, but McGregor's face wore a frown. "Mr. McGregor," said Rip Campbell. McGregor turned. For a moment he didn't recognize the speaker. Then his lips parted, and his eyes widened. "You!" he began. "I'd like to talk to you a minute," said Rip. He stepped aside, and McGregor's surprise, still written on his eyes, followed. Little and the girl stared at Rip, their faces puzzled. Rip pulled an envelope from his pocket and tendered it to McGregor. "Read that," he said. McGregor drew a paper from an envelope and unfolding it, read, "To those concerned, the bearer is Rip Campbell, employed by the Circle P brand at San Angelo, Texas. Any assistance rendered by peace officers or others will be appreciated. Hiram Meadows." "I work for High Meadows," Rip said, as McGregor refolded the paper and returned it in the envelope. "I'm here looking up some trouble for him. We lost 400 head of Circle P steers a little less than a month ago." "You came to the ranch?" said McGregor. "I remember now. You were looking for cattle that had run. You—" "Let me talk a minute," said Rip. Quickly then, touching only the high spots, Rip Campbell told McGregor the things he knew. Those things he surmised he did not touch upon. McGregor listened wordlessly. "I heard you talking when you were coming in," concluded Rip. "You had seen what that cross in a box would do to your Triangle Dot brand. Can you see what it would do to the Circle P?" McGregor nodded. "And Combe Andrews, the Circle P wagon boss, is lying under a pile of rocks where I put him," Rip said grimly. "I got to account for that to Meadows." "What do you want to do?" asked McGregor. "Bly's out of town. He's at his ranch. I don't see—" "I ain't told you all of it," Rip said honestly. "There's some more that I'm guessing at. Do you think Little shot Summers?" "Who else?" demanded McGregor. "His rifle was found in the camp, and there was a UMC shell found, and he had bought the last UMCs that Bly had. I went on his bond, but—" McGregor glanced down the street where Harvey Little stood beside his daughter. "They got the bullet that killed Summers?" asked Rip. "Doc's got it," answered McGregor. "But what—" "Will you vouch for me to him?" queried Rip. McGregor considered for a moment. "I will," he decided. "I've heard of High Meadows. You ought to be all right working for him." "Thanks," said Rip. "Let's go down there." McGregor nodded and, stepping away from Rip, spoke to Harvey and Charlotte. The two turned back to re-enter the store. McGregor rejoined Rip. Together, the two walked down the street, heading for the doctor's cottage. "Where's Davis?" asked Rip as they walked. "Out with Bly," answered McGregor. "He works for Bly in the store and does some ranch work." Rip frowned. McGregor's knock on the cottage door was answered by a small, thin, white-haired man who peered at the two through thick lensed glasses. "Come in," he greeted. "Did you decide that you didn't want to sign that bond after all?" "This is Rip Campbell, Doc Higgins," said McGregor. "He's here on business. Show Doc your letter, Campbell." Rip passed over Meadows' letter, and when Doc Higgins had read it through, he handed it back. "Well?" he asked. "What can I do for you, Mr. Campbell?" "I know High Meadows. Set a leg for one of his riders once. What is it you want?" "I'd like to see the bullet you took out of Till Summers," Rip answered. "In here," said Higgins. He led the way into a little littered room that eventually served as both justice and medical office. There from the desk he picked up a slug of lead and passed it to Rip. Rip held that piece of lead in his hand, rolling it gently in his palm. "And you thought that Summers had been shot with Harvey Little's .30-30? He said, half chingenly. "Look." From his shell belt, Rip produced a cartridge and held it up beside the piece of lead. The lead of the cartridge was almost identical in size with the bullet that Rip held. That bullet was deformed about the tip, but its base was not battered. "I pack a .45, Rip said gently. "That slug's from a .44-40. Who found the UMC shell, Mr. McPine?" "Why, Margrove found it," McGregor answered, surprised. The Triangle Dot owner stopped. His face darkened in a frown. "Margrove," he said slowly, "carries a .44-40. "You keep that slug, Doc," warned Rip, handing back the bullet to Higgins. "It's evidence. Do you feel better about signing Little's bond now, Mr. McGregor?" McGregor didn't answer that question. He had turned and was striding towards the office door. "Wait!" Higgins shrilled. "What's this all about?" but McGregor had gone through the door. Rip stopped at the entrance and turned. "We'll be back, Doc," he said casually. "Hang on to that slug." And then Rip Campbell, too, was gone. He caught up with McGregor before the irate ranchman reached Bly's. Putting a hand on McGregor's arm, Rip warned him. "Don't talk too much here," he said. "Let's start for the ranch. That's the first thing." McGregor nodded shortly. "You go back with me," he said. "Sure," agreed Rip. At the store, McGregor called Charlotte and Harvey. The two came out, wondering, but their questioning looks were not answered. McGregor helped the girl into the buckboard and indicated Rip's bedroll, still lying on the porch. "Put it in," he said. Rip picked up the bedroll and tossed it into the buckboard. "I got a saddle at the barber shop, too," he announced. "Likely I'll need it." "Well, get it," grated McGregor. "Get in, you two." "My saddle and stuff is at the jail," reminded Harvey Little. "Darn it," swore McGregor. "I'll get that, too. Will we never get out of this hole?" The two stops to collect belongings didn't take long, but McGregor fumed with impatience. It was not until they were out of town and he had stopped his team that the ranchman cooled at all. When he had stopped the team, he turned in his seat and held out his hand to Harvey Little, riding beside Rip in the back of the buckboard. "I'm a fool, Harvey," said McGregor. "I know that you didn't have anything to do with the shooting of Summers." Little took the extended hand. "I'm sure glad you believe that, Mr. McGregor," he said. "How?" "Never mind," interrupted McGregor. "Campbell will tell you. We're going to the ranch now." Little turned and looked at Rip. Charlotte McGregor had her arms around her father's neck and was kissing his weathered cheek. McGregor had started the team, but he didn't seem to mind the girl's exuberance. When Charlotte did free her arms, McGregor held the reins in one hand. The other arm he put around his daughter's waist. "Campbell," said Harvey Little. "How come you're Campbell?" "I was born that way," said Rip. "Listen." The buckboard rattled on, and Rip talked to Harvey Little. Chapter 9. When they reached the ranch, McGregor stopped the team and went straight to the cook shack. The cook knew from the boss's manner that something was afoot, but could impart no information. He didn't know where the men had ridden that day. McGregor ordered the cook to look after the buckboard team, and, taking Harvey Little and Rip with him, went into the house and to his office. Charlotte had already joined her mother. The girl was apprehensive as to what was to come, but happy because Harvey was out and free and her father believed Harvey innocent. In the office, McGregor turned to Rip Campbell. "What are you going to do now?" he inquired. Rip frowned. "Well, I sort of wanted to jump Margrove," he said, "but Margrove ain't here. I reckon I'll go to the hate camp." "It'll be too late," warned McGregor. "Why not wait till—" "I've been waiting," Rip said grimly. "I reckon I can finish my business at the camp pretty quick." "What are you going to do there?" asked McGregor. "I'm going to jump Bill Walters," said Rip. "I'm going to tell him that I found Andrews and accuse him of killing Combe." "And then what?" McGregor said, hard at Rip. "Then I don't know what'll happen," Rip said simply. "The way I figure it out, Bill started that run. He killed Combe, but he came to camp after the run. That meant that there was men helping. I think that Bly was behind it. By George!" exclaimed McGregor. "I got a letter from Pueblo. I never opened it. Too excited, I guess. Wait!" He produced an envelope from his coat pocket and tore it open. Scanning the sheet enclosed, he grunted and passed the missive across to Rip. Answering McGregor's request, his friend in Pueblo had written that 400 head of cross-in-a-box steers had been sold in Pueblo 2 weeks ago. The buyer of those steers, so the writer continued, said that he had contracted with Jake Bly for some 300 more steers to be delivered later in the year. "There's my Circle P," Rip said grimly as he passed the letter back. "And there's 300 triangle dots he contracted for," replied McGregor. I reckon we might see Mr. Bly pretty soon, greeted Rip. First, though, I aim to settle with Walters. I want to get Combs' body taken care of, and I want to find out who was with Bly and handled the cattle. I want to clean up McGregor. McGregor frowned. So do I, he agreed. The trouble is, I don't know who I can trust now. Harvey here is all right, but Margrove I'd have bet on, and Margrove is crooked. He killed Till Summers. I would have trusted Margrove with whatever I had. Now, well, I don't know who to trust. There's Granny Black, suggested Rip. McGregor's face lighted. Sure, there's Granny, he agreed. There was a knock on the office door, and Mrs. McGregor's voice came. I brought a lunch for you men, she said. You better eat. We had better, agreed Rip, as McGregor opened the door. While we can. There were sandwiches and pie on the tray that the gray-haired Martha McGregor brought into the room. Behind her mother came Charlotte carrying the coffee pot. The men ate and drank, while the women hovering anxiously in the background. Mrs. McGregor put her hand on her husband's shoulder and looked at Rip. Trouble? She asked tremulously. Trouble, Martha. Charlotte came to stand beside Harvey Little. Do you have to go, Ian? Asked Mrs. McGregor. Couldn't you send someone? I've always killed my own snakes, Martha, said McGregor. Rip looked at the pie on his plate. There wasn't anybody to stand behind Rip Campbell. No one to worry about whether or not he went into trouble and came out of it. For an instant, that bitter thought was in Rip's mind. Then suddenly, he was glad that it was so. He looked up and smiled at the gray-haired woman, turned and included Charlotte in that smile. I wouldn't worry none if I was you, said Rip to the two women. Martha McGregor's eyes searched Rip's face. Gradually, the worried expression she wore was supplanted by one of confidence. Charlotte, her hand on Harvey's shoulder, let a little breath of relief escape her lips. I like to go to the hay camp pretty quick, said Rip to McGregor. I like to start a wagon out there to get... The presence of the women caused him to refrain from mentioning Comandrew's body. Well, I'd like to go, he finished lamely. McGregor wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Let's go then, he said. There were horses in the corral at the triangle dot. The men roped out mounts and saddled. The two women had gone to the corrals with them, and when they mounted, Harvey Little rode close to Charlotte. Leaning down from the saddle, he kissed the girl full on the lips. McGregor did not frown, and there was a look of contentment in Martha McGregor's eyes. I'll be back tonight, Martha, said Ian McGregor. The three rode away, leaving the women standing beside the corral gate. While it was some 3 hours past noon, the men didn't hurry. There seemed to be something of a grim certainty in the way they rode. It was a trot, walk, trot, and canter, covering the ground, going in inexorably like death. It seemed to Rip Campbell that he had done this before, again, and yet again. McGregor rode close to him and spoke. We might have brought a deputy with us, he said. We might have. Your deputy is Jake Bly's man, reminded Rip. McGregor looked at Rip's square-cut face. And you are your own authority. All right, Campbell. When we get to camp, you and Harvey stay on your horses, ordered Rip. There's one, maybe 2 men there that might make a break for it. I don't want them to get away. He knew that if McGregor and Little were mounted, they would not take part in what was sure to come. He knew that Bill Walters would not sit supine and submit to being taken. But Rip intended to be on the ground when he spoke to Walters. If Walters did submit, well, it'd be all right. If Walters did not submit, Rip thought of Comandrew's. That would be all right, too. But the play did not come up as Rip had anticipated. When the three reached the hay camp, the place was deserted except for the cook, who crawled out from under the chuck wagon to greet them. The cook was sleepy-eyed and smelled of vanilla extract. "Where's Black?" asked McGregor, looking down at the cook. Out in the meadow, answered the cook. You all gonna stay for supper? He was eyeing Rip, not sure that he had seen the rusty-haired rider before, but still half recognizing him. No, answered McGregor. Anybody here today? The cook thought a moment. Margrove was in at noon, he said. He went down to the Bend camp, said he'd be back. That's all that's been here. McGregor looked at Rip, his eyebrows lifted. We'll go to the camp, Rip said quietly. I reckon we better not try to take a wagon with us for Andrews. The horses ain't in. McGregor nodded. Let's get going then, he said impatiently. Tell Black we'll be back. You better stay for supper, the cook called after them. The three left the camp and rode on toward the river. Again it was a trot, walk, trot, and canter, and then as they reached the hardpan, they saw a rider coming toward them. Margrove, said Harvey Little harshly, and Rip saw the youngster loosen in his holster the six-shooter that he had borrowed at the ranch. Keep that thing covered up, said Rip forcefully. Little looked at Rip, scowled, but removed his hand from the butt of the gun. As the Triangle Dot foreman drew closer, Rip reined his horse a little to the right, so that a small space separated him from McGregor and Little. The single man and the three men drew closer and closer, and then, when Margrove saw who was approaching, he stopped his horse. The others rode up, still in their open formation, and stopped. Hello, said Margrove, addressing McGregor, but looked at Harvey Little. You looking for me? I am, snapped McGregor. Easy, warned Rip, noting the anger in McGregor's voice. Let me. Yeah, we're looking for you, Margrove. Margrove looked at Rip, studying him. You're, he began. I'm the fellow that worked for the hay crew, said Rip. I didn't take your tip about going over to Bly's. Thanks just the same, but I'm a little too wise to be sent over to be killed. Puzzlement wrote itself on Margrove's face. Killed? He echoed. The look of puzzlement could not be assumed. Rip, watching the Triangle Dot cowboss, was suddenly forced to revise his beliefs. His voice was less certain when he spoke again. You figured on that, didn't you? He demanded. Bly wanted me over there where him and some of his men could take care of me. I wasn't fool enough to go. Bly? Said Margrove. Quit stalling, snapped McGregor. Margrove, we got the goods on you. You know Summers was a detective that I'd gotten in here. You killed him and tried to plant the killing on Harvey here. I ought to let Harvey have you. Wait, ordered Rip. Margrove's face had turned white. His eyes were wide and round. There was a look of appeal on his face as he stared at Rip. Your rifle was in the haystack back at camp, Margrove, Rip said accusingly. I saw you from the mesa when you got to Summers. I know that you was packing a rifle when you come in. You carry a 44-40, and Summers was killed with a 44-40. You found that 30-30 UMC shell that you claimed was from Harvey's gun. Harvey's gun was gone, and when him and I got to his camp, there it was again. You killed Summers, Margrove, and tried to plant it on Harvey. You can give up or go for your iron. Margrove seemed to slump. His face, white beneath his tan, took on the lines of age. His shoulders sagged. I never killed Summers, he blurted. I found him after he'd been shot. I saw that, said Rip grimly. You found him after you had shot him. Margrove whimpered again. I didn't kill him. I found him, I tell you. I'd taken Little's rifle. I was going to beef one or two cows and hang 'em up so McGregor would fire him. Charlotte, keep her out of this, snapped Harvey Little. Your tongue ain't fit to speak of her. I got Spanky to bring my gun in when he come to the ranch, Margrove finished weakly. He'd wanted to work for me, punching, and I got him to do it. I put Harvey's rifle back in the camp. Rip looked at McGregor. I reckon that's the truth, he said slowly. What about it, McGregor? McGregor was looking at the horn of his saddle, his face a study. Slowly he lifted his head and turned to Harvey Little. "Well, it's up to you, Harvey," said McGregor. Harvey Little kept his eyes on Margrove. His hand was again on the butt of his gun, clutching it. Slowly, his hand relaxed. "I reckon," said Harvey Little, fighting the words out, "that I don't want him." Chapter 10. Rip Campbell let go of the breath he held. Harvey Little had been for a moment in the position of both judge and executioner, and Harvey Little had come through. McGregor let the words come slowly from his lips. "You get off the place, Margrove," he said. "Don't go to the ranch. Don't go near it. Pull out. Your gear will be taken to Trinchera. You can get it there, and I'll expect to find that horse in town. Get out, and don't come back, and get out now." The ranch owner's face was stony. Sudden relief flooded Margrove's face. His shoulders almost squared, his head came up a little. He opened his mouth to speak, but Rip Campbell forestalled that. "Shut up," snapped Rip. "Get going and thank your stars that you're a lucky dang fool." Margrove glanced from Rip to the others and lifted his reins. His horse stepped forward, and suddenly Margrove thrust in his spurs, and the horse leaped ahead. As Rip and the other two turned, Margrove bent forward in his saddle, like a man who seeks to escape pursuing lead, and with the horse running full out, swept across the hardpan. When he was gone, there was silence among the three. Then Rip, looking at Harvey Little, spoke slowly. "I reckon you're fit for that girl, Harvey," said Rip gently, and he spurred his horse. They rode back toward the hay camp. Rip's mind was busy. If Herb Margrove had not killed Summers, and Rip was convinced that he had not killed Summers, then who was guilty? There was no answer to that. McGregor voiced the problem. "Margrove didn't do it," said McGregor with conviction. "Who did?" "A cross-in-the-box brand," mused Rip, half aloud. McGregor caught the implication. "Bly! Damn him!" swore McGregor. When the trio sighted the hay camp, they saw activity. Men were pulling in from the meadow, bringing their teams. The fat, squat figure of Granny Black was by the fire, and Granny was talking, looking up at two men who sat in a buckboard. "Lie," McGregor said again. "That's him. His deputy's with him," said Rip slowly, for Jack Davis sat beside Bly in the buckboard seat. "Who's that in the back?" "Gray," snapped Harvey. "Sure enough," agreed Rip. "McGregor, let me do the talking. You'll spill things if you do it. You're mad." "I'll talk to him," vowed McGregor. He's stole Circle P cattle, and he's the man that had Combe killed." Rip's voice was hard. "Do I talk, or do I ride in and take to shooting? Which, McGregor?" "You can talk," grunted McGregor, repressing his wrath. "But I think—" "Let me talk, then," snapped Rip. But Granny Black did the talking when the three arrived. McGregor had no time to dismount before Granny was at his stirrup. "Jack Bly has come over to take some of my men," announced Granny, looking up at McGregor. "I'll never get this hay cut, what with men leaving and me having to fire." Granny caught sight of Rip. There was no hesitancy in his recognition. He broke off his complaint to McGregor. "I knew you was a rider," said Black. "I knew it." Rip Campbell dismounted. He was almost at the fire. His horse stood behind him, and Rip moved to his left hand, and the horse stepped away. To Rip's right was the buckboard with Jake Bly and Jack Davis and Gray Cook. Gray had risen. To Rip's left were Bill Walters and Ted Daly. Walters had his hand in the bib of his overalls, and there was a gun in that hand. Talk about sitting on a powder keg. Rip knew that he was on one and that a match had been lit. But from the corner of his eyes, Rip saw that Harvey Little had almost dismounted and stepped away. Harvey was now clear of the buckboard and on the other side, and Rip Campbell thanked his lucky stars that Harvey Little was no fool. The kid was coming through in a tight. Mentally, Rip decided that Little would do to take along. McGregor on his horse was out of the picture, but Granny Black had sensed that something was wrong, had felt the tension, and had stepped back so that he too was clear of Rip. To the right and left, the hay hands their teams neglected were gathered, and they too watched the stage so carefully set. For a minute or two, no one moved or spoke. Each man held his position as if sudden command had halted him, waiting while the tension increased. Then Rip began to talk. "I wouldn't worry about losing men, Granny," said Rip carefully. "It can't be helped. You're bound to lose some once in a while, just like a trail herd is bound to lose steers once in a while." "What?" asked Granny. Rip looked at Walters. "I found Comb, Bill," Rip said slowly, almost casually. "Found him just where you'd left him. You got your gun back out of my bedroll, didn't you?" It was an invitation. Bill Walters recognized it as such, but Bill Walters didn't want to accept that invitation. Bill Walters wanted to live a while longer, and he was afraid. Rip waited. When Walters didn't move, he spoke again, this time to Jake Bly. "Them Circle P steers you sold in Pueblo, Bly," he said. "Did you get a price for them? High Meadows will want to know." It seemed to Bill Walters in that instant that Rip had taken his eyes from him. It seemed to Bill Walters that it was the chance he wanted. Here were Jake Bly and Gray Cook and Ted Daly all on his side. Here was the law in the person of Jack Davis, and the law was also on his side. Bill Walters brought his hand from the bib of his overalls, and there was a gun in that hand, Bill Walters' own .41 Colt. But Bill Walters had been mistaken. Rip stepped back a little as Walters moved, and as he stepped back, he dropped his hand in a short arc. Both guns roared, and while Rip Campbell staggered from the slug that brushed through his coat sleeve and grazed his arm, Bill Walters stood erect with surprise on his face and then pitched down. He twitched, then lay still. A voice, Granny Black's voice, came sharply. "Stop it, Daly!" Rip had no time to look at Daly. He had seen Jake Bly drop the lines of the buckboard's team, and he had seen Gray Cook drop back into the bed of the buckboard. As he dropped the lines, Bly had stooped, and the twin muzzles of a shotgun now appeared. Rip Campbell, coolly as though shooting at a target, sent slugs whistling into the dash of the buckboard. The shotgun barrels tilted up, and one discharged, belching lead against the sky. Then the barrels fell. Jack Davis, face ashen, sat on the seat of the buckboard and lifted his hands high, reaching up as though he could not get them high enough. And Harvey Little was walking toward the rear of the buckboard, the gun in his hand sending up a little trail of smoke. "That's right," said Granny Black's voice. "Reach, Daly." And then the hay hands were crowding in, and McGregor, a mixture of awe and force in his voice, was ordering them back. And Rip was standing over Bill Walters, looking down at the man he had killed. As he stared at the white face, Rip was conscious that his hate for Walters had gone. There was no feeling in him except relief. His job was finished. It took some time to get things sorted out. Gray Cook was dead in the back of the buckboard. There was a .44-40 rifle in Gray's hands, but only 2 shells were discharged. Gray had made the mistake of shooting at Rip while Harvey Little was shooting at him. Gray would make no more mistakes. Harvey Little held the rifle up. .44-40, said Harvey. "Here's the man that killed Summers, I reckon." Jake Bly had dropped the shotgun and was lying across Jack Davis's feet. Jake Bly would see no more steers that year. Jake Bly would never plan again to sell steers or to run them over the Malapias and down across the hardpan to the river. Ted Daly held his hands high, as did Jack Davis, and both were white, for they had come through death and were still alive. Such experiences shake a man, however hard, and Jack Davis and Ted Daly were willing to talk. Indeed, they concurred and amplified Rip Campbell's explanation, the explanation he gave to Granny Black, and the hay hands gathered about. And while the two prisoners talked, old Granny Black kept staring at Rip and nodding as if he had expected all this would happen. Jack Davis and Ted Daly had been with Bly and Gray Cook that night the Circle P steers had run. They had helped Bill Walters bury Combe Andrews on the sandbar. "He oughtn't to have killed Combe," Davis wailed. "There wasn't no sense in killing him. Bly said so." Bly had it all framed with Walters to run the cattle. It was the cross-in-a-box brand that put the business into his head. He'd seen where he could blot the Circle P brand, and he'd seen where he could change the triangle dot. He had it all planned so we could make our killing a getaway. Rip had been right, too. As to the method of running off the cattle, Davis and Daly agreed. They also told of how Jake Bly had held the steers in a Rincon Mesa on his own ranch, and how the brands had been altered before the cattle were sold, and Gray Cook had killed Summers. Bly had ordered it when he had learned that Summers was a stock detective and had seen Summers on the side of the river. A nice, tight little corporation it had been with Bly, a respectable merchant and ranchman at its head, and Walters, Daly, Gray Cook, and Davis to do the dirty work. "If he hadn't been so sly, we would have made it," said Jack Davis bitterly. "Having Gray get in on the triangle dot to see where the cattle were placed and putting Walters and Daly in here with the Granger wagon was what upset things." And so, when the story had been told, bodies were loaded into a wagon, and Granny Black dispatched another wagon and 2 men to the mesa for Combe Andrews' body. And the cook swore because his steaks was burned, and the men, talking still and excited, drifted away toward the fire. Daly and Davis were bound and placed in the wagon with the bodies of those others, while Granny Black, on the seat beside the driver, watched his prisoners on their trip to the ranch. Then it was that Harvey Little bound Rip's arm with a clean handkerchief, and the 3 men mounted to ride back to the triangle dot. Late that night, at the headquarters ranch, Rip Campbell wrote 2 letters. Both letters were to High Meadows, and both were identical, but one was addressed to Alps Hotel in Denver, and the other to the Circle P Ranch in San Angelo. "Dear Mr. Meadows, I have found Combe Andrews, and he will be buried here in his country. Bill Walters killed him the night the herd ran. Bill Walters is going to be buried up here, too. You'll have to collect off the estate of a man named Jake Bly for the steers. He sold them as a cross-in-the-box cattle in Pueblo. Mr. McGregor of the Triangle Dot Ranch here, near Trinchera, will help you. I hope you won't have no trouble, as we will have to collect for the steers. I don't know if you'll want to give me the $2 a head or not, but that'll be all right, as I'm leaving here for San Angelo in about a week, and we can talk it over then. I'm having to stay here for a week at least, because they say they can't get ready for the wedding in less time than that, and I'm going to be the best man. And I have got to stay for the inquest, hoping that you don't have no trouble about the steers. I am, yours truly, Rip Campbell." Carrying his literary masterpieces, Rip went from McGregor's office and to the porch. Down at the bunkhouse, there were lights where the Triangle Dot riders and Granny Black sat as guards upon Jack Davis and Ted Daly. There were no lights in the old bunkhouse, but it was occupied. There were 4 bodies there. Combe Andrews lay beside the men that had killed him. On the end of the porch, a cigar tip glowed. Ian McGregor sat there with his arms about his wife. There was no light on the other end of the porch, but little sounds came to Rip. Small, soft sounds as of a kiss given and returned. Rip Campbell, grinning a little, put the letters he had written into his hip pocket. Very silently he turned and walked back into the house. Seated once more in McGregor's office, Rip reopened his 2 letters, unfolded them, and picked up his pencil. He sucked the pencil thoughtfully for a moment, and then, the grin broadening, added a postscript. P.S. It looks like I might be able to get away a little quicker. This has been Cowpoke, a classic Western action thriller, a Rip Campbell adventure. Written by Curtis Long, narrated by David Kresser. Copyright 2020 by Grand Ozarks Media. Production copyright by Grand Ozarks Media.